Vienna. Shortly after his mother's death, the family broke up and Adolph went to Vienna to make his way in the world as his father had done before him. This was early in 1908. How much money he took with him, if any, is not known. The records here are very vague, particularly since all biographers have gone on the supposition that his mother died a year later than she actually did. This leaves an entire year unaccounted for, since the next thing we hear of Adolph, he has again applied for admission to the examinations for the Academy of Art. One of the conditions for re-examination was that he submit to the board some of the paintings he had done previously. This he did, but the board was not impressed with him and refused to allow him to enter the examination. This, it seems, was even a greater shock than his failure to pass the examinations a year earlier. After he had received notification to the effect that his work was of such a nature that it did not warrant his admission to the second examination, he interviewed the director. He claims that the director told him that his drawings showed clearly that his talents lay in the direction of architecture rather than pure art, and advised him to seek admission to the architectural school. This he applied for, but was not admitted, according to his story, because he had not satisfactorily finished the course in the real Schule. To be sure, this was one of the general requirements, but exceptions could be made in the case of boys who showed unusual talent. Hitler's rejection, therefore, was on the grounds of insufficient talent, rather than for failure to complete his school course. He was now without hope. All his dreams of being a great artist seemed to be nipped in the bud. He was without money and without friends. He was forced to go to work and found employment as a laborer on construction jobs. This, however, did not suit him. Friction developed between himself and his fellow workmen. It seems logical to suppose that he was working beneath his class and refused to mingle with them, for he tells us that he sat apart from the others and ate his lunch. Further difficulties developed inasmuch as the workmen tried to convert him to a Marxian point of view. Their attitudes and arguments jarred him, since they were far from the ideal Germany that had been portrayed by his favorite Linz teacher, Ludwig Poch, an ardent German nationalist. But Hitler found himself unable to answer their arguments. He made the unpleasant discovery that the workmen knew more than he did. He was fundamentally against everything they said, but he was unable to justify his point of view on an intellectual level. He was at a terrible disadvantage. In order to remedy the situation, he began reading all kinds of political pamphlets and attending political meetings, but not with the idea of understanding the problem as a whole, which might have enabled him to form an intelligent opinion, but to find arguments which would support his earlier conviction. This is a trait that runs throughout his life. He never studies to learn, but only to justify what he feels. In other words, his judgments are based wholly on emotional factors, and are then clothed with an intellectual argument. Soon he tells us he knew more than they did about their own political ideology, and was able to tell them things about it which they did not know themselves. It was this, according to Hitler, which antagonized the workmen against him. In any case, he was run off the job with the threat that if he appeared again, they would push him off the scaffold. This must have been during the first half of 1909, when he was 20 years old. Without a job, he sunk lower and lower in the social scale, and at times must have been on the verge of starvation. At times he found an odd job, such as carrying luggage, shoveling snow, or running errands, but a large part of his time was spent in bread lines or begging in the streets. In November 1909, he was ousted from his room because he did not pay his rent and was forced to seek refuge in a flophouse. Here he met Reinhold Hannisch, who was in much the same predicament. Years later, Hannisch wrote a long book about his associations with Hitler during this period. It is a gruesome story of unbelievable poverty. Hitler must have been a sorry sight during these days, with a full black beard, badly clothed, and a haggard look. Hannisch writes, quote, "It was a miserable life, and I once asked him what he was really waiting for. The answer, I don't know myself. I have never seen such hopeless letting down in distress." Unquote. Hannisch took him in hand and encouraged him to do some painting. The difficulty was that neither one had the money with which to buy materials. When Hannisch discovered that Hitler had signed over his inheritance to his sister, he persuaded Hitler to write her and obtain a small loan. This was presumably his half-sister Angela. When the money was received, Hitler's first thought was to take a week's vacation in order to recuperate. At this time he moved into the Mannerheim Brigettenau, which was slightly better than the flop houses in which he had been staying. He and Hannisch went into business together. It was Hitler's job to paint postcards, posters, watercolors, which Hannisch then took around Vienna and peddled to art dealers, furniture stores, etc. In this he was quite successful, but his difficulties were not at an end. The moment Hitler got a little money, he refused to work. Hannisch describes this vividly, quote, "But unfortunately Hitler was never an ardent worker. I was often driven to despair by bringing in orders that he simply wouldn't carry out. At Easter 1910, We earned 40 kronen on a big order, and we divided it equally. The next morning, when I came downstairs and asked for Hitler, I was told he had already left with Neumann, a Jew. After that, I couldn't find him for a week. He was sightseeing in Vienna with Neumann and spent much of the time in the museum. When I asked him what the matter was and whether we were going to keep on working, he answered that he must recuperate now, that he must have some leisure, that he was not a coolie. When the week was over, he had no longer any money." Unquote. At this time, Hitler was not a Jew-hater. There were a number of Jews living in the men's home with whom he was on excellent terms. Most of his paintings were sold to Jewish dealers, who paid just as much for them as the Aryans. He also admired Rothschild for sticking to his religion, even if it prevented him from entering court. During this time, he also sent 2 postcards to Dr. Bloch in Linz, who was a Jew. One of these was just a picture postcard of Vienna, the other a copy which he had painted. On both of them, he wrote his deep gratitude to the doctor. This is mentioned because it is one of the very few cases in which we have any record in which Hitler showed any lasting gratitude. During this time, Hitler looked himself very Jewish. Hanisch writes, quote, "Hitler at that time looked very Jewish, so that I often joked with him that he must be of Jewish blood, since such a large beard rarely grows on a Christian's chin. He also had big feet, as a desert wanderer must have." Unquote. In spite of his close association with Hanisch, the relationship ended in a quarrel. Hitler accused Hanisch of withholding some of the money he had received for a picture. He had Hanisch arrested and appeared as a witness against him. We have little knowledge of what happened to Hitler after this time. According to Hafstangl, the home in which Hitler lived had the reputation of being a place where homosexual men frequently went to find companions. Jan said that he had information from a Viennese official that on the police record Hitler was listed as a sexual pervert, but it gave no details of offenses. It is possible that the entry may have been made solely on suspicion. Simone claims that the Viennese police file in 1912 recorded a charge of theft against Hitler, and that he moved from Vienna to Munich in order to avoid arrest. This would fit in with Hafstangl's suspicion that Hitler's elder half-brother, who was twice convicted for theft, was in Vienna at that time, and that they may have become involved in some minor crime. This would not be impossible, for Hanisch tells us that Hitler frequently spent his time figuring out shady ways of making money. One example may be of interest. Quote, "He proposed to fill old tin cans with paste and sell them to shopkeepers, the paste to be smeared on window panes to keep them from freezing in winter. It should be sold in the summer when it couldn't be tried out. I told him it wouldn't work because the merchants would just say come back in the winter. Hitler answered that one must possess a talent for oratory." Unquote. Since Hitler could only be brought to work when he was actually hungry, he spent a good deal of time reading political pamphlets, sitting in cafe houses, reading newspapers, and delivering speeches to the other inmates of the home. He became a great admirer of Georg von Schonerer and the Viennese mayor Karl Lueger. It was presumably from them that he learned his anti-Semitism and many of the tricks of a successful politician. According to Hanisch, his companions were greatly amused by him and often ridiculed him and his opinions. In any event, it seems that he got a good deal of practice in speech-making during these early years, which stood him in good stead later on. Even in these days, he talked about starting a new party. It is not clear why he remained in Vienna and lived in such poverty for 5 years, when he had such a deep love for Germany and could have gone there with relatively little difficulty. It is also not clear why he went when he did, unless there is some truth in the supposition that he fled Vienna to avoid arrest. His own explanation is that he could not tolerate the mixture of people, particularly the Jews and always more Jews, and says that for him Vienna is the symbol of incest. But as far as Hitler is concerned, this time was not lost. As he looks back over that period, he can say, quote, "So in a few years I built a foundation of knowledge from which I still draw nourishment today. At that time I formed an image of the world and a view of life which became the granite foundation for my actions." Unquote. Pre-war Munich. In Munich before the war, things were no better for him. As far as poverty is concerned, he might as well have stayed in Vienna. He earned a little money painting postcards and posters and at times painting houses. Early in 1913, he went to Salzburg to report for duty in the army, but was rejected on the grounds of poor physical condition. He returned to Munich and continued to work at odd jobs and sit in cafe houses, where he spent his time reading newspapers. Nothing of which we have any knowledge happened during this time which is pertinent to our present study. The prospects of ever making anything out of himself in the future must have been very black at that time. World War. Then came the World War. He writes of this occasion, quote, The struggle of the year 1914 was forsooth, not forced on the masses, but desired by the whole people. To myself those hours came like a redemption from the vexatious experiences of my youth. Even to this day I am not ashamed to say that, in a transport of enthusiasm, I sank down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart." Unquote. On August 3, 1914, Hitler joined a Bavarian regiment as a volunteer. During the first days of the war, his regiment suffered very heavy losses and was not particularly popular among the Bavarian people. Hitler became an orderly in regimental headquarters as well as a runner. The one thing that all his comrades commented on was his subservience to superior officers. It seems that he went out of his way to court their good graces, offering to do their washing and other menial tasks, much to the disgust of his comrades. He was not popular with the other men and always remained aloof from them. When he did join them, he usually harangued about political matters. During the 4 years of war, he received no packages or mail from anyone. In this he was unique. At Christmas time, when everyone else was receiving gifts and messages, he withdrew from the group and sulked moodily by himself. When his comrades encouraged him to join the group and share their packages, he refused. On October 7, 1916, he was wounded by a piece of shrapnel and sent to a hospital. It was a light wound, and he was soon discharged and sent to Munich as a replacement. After 2 days there, he wrote his commanding officer, Captain Wiedemann, asking that he be reinstated in his regiment because he could not tolerate Munich when he knew his comrades were at the front. Wiedemann had him returned to the regiment, where he remained until October 14th, when he was exposed to mustard gas and sent to a hospital in Pasewalk. He was blind and, according to Friedlinde Wagner, also lost his voice. It seems that mystery always follows Hitler. His career in the army is no exception. There are several things that have never been satisfactorily explained. The first is that he spent 4 years in the same regiment, but was never advanced beyond the rank of first-class private or lance corporal. The second is the Iron Cross First Class, which he constantly wears. This has been the topic of much discussion, but the mystery has never been solved. There was no mention of the award in the history of his regiment. This is rather amazing, inasmuch as other awards of this kind are listed. Hitler is mentioned in a number of other connections, but not in this one, although it is alleged that it was awarded to him for capturing 12 Frenchmen, including an officer, single-handed. This is certainly no ordinary feat in any regiment, and one would expect that it would at least merit some mention, particularly in the view of the fact that Hitler had considerable fame as a politician when the book went to press. The Nazi propaganda agencies have not helped to clarify the situation. Not only have a number of different versions of the story appeared in the press, but each gives a different number of Frenchmen he is alleged to have captured. They have also published alleged facsimiles of his war record, which do not agree. The Berlin Industrierte Zeitung of August 10, 1939, printed a facsimile in which the date of award for his decoration was clearly August 4, 1918. Yet the Volkische Beobachter of August 14, 1934, had published a facsimile in which the date of the award was October 4, 1918. Although these alleged facsimiles mentioned other citations, they did not include the date of award of the Iron Cross Second Class. From all that can be learned, the First Class Cross was never awarded unless the recipient had already been awarded the Second Class decoration. Just what the facts are, it is impossible to determine. It is alleged that his war record has been badly tampered with, and that von Schleicher was eliminated during the blood purge because he knew the true facts. Strasser, who served in the same division, has probably as good an explanation as any. He says that during the last months of the war, there were so many first-class crosses being given out that the General Headquarters was no longer able to pass on the merits of each individual case. To facilitate matters, a number of these decorations were allotted to each regiment every month to be issued by commanding officers. They in turn notified the High Command of the award and the deed which merited it. According to Strasser, when the army began to collapse, the regimental headquarters had in their possession a number of decorations which had not been awarded. Since few members of the headquarters staff ever received an award of this type, they took advantage of the general melee and gave them to each other and forged the signature of the commanding officer in sending it to the High Command. The thing that speaks in favor of this explanation is the curious bond which exists between Hitler and his regimental sergeant major, Max Amann, who was later to become the head of the Nazi Heer Verlag. This is one of the most lucrative positions in the entire Nazi hierarchy, and Amann was called to the position by Hitler. The only explanation for this lack of promotion that has been published is the comment of one of his officers to the effect that he would never make a non-commissioned officer out of that neurotic fellow, Hitler. Rauschening gives a different explanation. He claims that a high Nazi had once confided in him that he had seen Hitler's military record, and that it contained an item of a court-martial which found him guilty of pederastic practices with an officer, and that it was for this reason he was never promoted. Rauschening also claims that in Munich Hitler was found guilty of a violation of paragraph 175, which deals with pederasty. No other evidence of either of these two charges has been found. The mystery becomes even deeper when we learn from a great many informants that Hitler was quite courageous and never tried to evade dangerous assignments. It is said that he was unusually adept at running, then falling or seeking shelter when the fire became intense. It also seems that he was always ready to volunteer for special assignments and was considered exceedingly reliable in the performance of all his duties by his own officers. It may be well to mention at this point that when Hitler entered the army, he again became a member of a recognized and respected social institution. No longer did he have to stand in breadlines or seek shelter in flophouses. For the first time since his mother died, he did really belong to a group of people. Not only did this provide him with a sense of pride and security, but at last he had achieved his great ambition, namely, to be united with the German nation. It is also interesting to note a considerable change in his appearance. From the dirty, greasy, cast-off clothes of Jews and other charitable people, he was now privileged to wear a uniform. Mend, one of his comrades, tells us that when Hitler came out of the trenches or back from an assignment, he spent hours cleaning his uniform and boots until he became the joke of the regiment. Quite a remarkable change for one who for almost 7 years refused to exert himself just a little in order to pull himself out of the pitiful conditions in which he lived among the dregs of society. Post-war. Then came the armistice, and all this was over. Adolf Hitler, from a psychological point of view, was in exactly the same position as the one in which he found himself 11 years before when his mother died. He faced the future alone. The army, his home for 4 years, was breaking up. Again he stood alone before a dismal future, a world in which he could not find a niche, a world in which did not care for him, a world of aimless existence fraught with hardships. It was almost more than he could bear, and he went into a deep depression, which continued for a considerable period of time. Where to go and what to do? Having no home or family to greet him, he returned to Munich, not because it had been kind to him in the past, but because he had no other place to go. He could take up his life again where he had left off 4 years earlier. He wandered around Munich for a short time, a stray dog looking for a master. Then it is reported that he went to Vienna to visit his half-sister Angela, with whom he had no contact for many years. If he actually made this trip, he did not stay long, for soon he was back in the reserve army, stationed at Traunstein. Here he could wear the uniform and eat the food of the army, and he stayed on there from April 1920, there until April 1920, when the camp was broken up. Then he returned to Munich, still attached to the army and living in the barracks. During this time, he seems to have continued his political discussions with his comrades, siding with the Social Democrats against the Communists. According to the Municher Post, he actually affiliated himself with the Social Democratic Party. After the counter-revolution, every 10th man in the barracks was shot, but Hitler was singled out beforehand and asked to stand to one side. At the inquiry, he appeared before the board with a charge list against some of his comrades, which can only signify denunciations for communistic activities. He had been spying on his comrades and now assigned them to the executioner. In Mein Kampf, he refers to this occupation as his first more or less political activity. The army now undertook to educate its soldiers in the proper political philosophy, and Hitler was assigned to such a course. He spoke so ably in this group that his talent for speaking impressed an officer who was present, and Hitler was appointed education officer. His hour had struck. He was discovered and appreciated, singled out for his talent. He threw himself into this work with great enthusiasm, always speaking to larger groups. His confidence grew with his success in swaying people. He was on his way to become a politician. From here on, his career is a matter of history and need not be reviewed here. This is the foundation of Hitler's character. Whatever he tried to be afterwards is only superstructure, and the superstructure can be no firmer than the foundations on which it rests. The higher it goes, the more unstable it becomes, the more it needs to be propped up and patched up in order to make it hold together. This is not an easy job. It requires constant vigilance, strong defenses, and heavy losses in time and energy. There was a unanimous agreement among the 4 psychoanalysts who have studied the material that Hitler is a hysteric bordering on schizophrenia and not a true paranoiac, as so frequently supposed. This means he is not insane in the commonly accepted sense of the term, but neurotic. He has not lost complete contact with the world about him and is still striving to make some kind of psychological adjustment which will give him a feeling of security in his social group. It also means that there is a definite moral component in his character, no matter how deeply it may be buried or how seriously it has been distorted. With this diagnosis established, we are in a position to make a number of surmises concerning the conscious mental processes which ordinarily take place in Hitler's mind. These form the nucleus of the Hitler he consciously knows and must live with. It is in all probability not a happy Hitler, but one harassed by fears, anxieties, doubts, misgivings, uncertainties, condemnations, feelings of loneliness and of guilt. From our experience with other hysterics, we are probably on firm ground when we suppose that Hitler's mind is like a battle royale, most of the time with many conflicting and contradictory forces and impulses pulling him this way and that. Such a state of confusion is not easy to bear. A large part of his energies are usually wasted in wrestling with himself instead of being directed towards the external world. He can see possibilities for gratifications around him, but only rarely can he muster enough energy to make a consistent effort. Fears, doubts, and implications obstruct his thinking and acting, and he becomes indecisive, and he frequently ends up doing nothing. Vicarious gratifications through fantasies become substitutes for the satisfaction obtained from real achievements. We must suppose that this is the state that Hitler was in during the 7 years that elapsed between the death of his mother and the outbreak of the war, when he was wasting his time lying around in flophouses and sitting in cafes in Vienna. Only when his hunger became acute could he muster the energy necessary to apply himself to a few hours of work. As soon as this hunger was appeased, he lapsed back into his former state of procrastination and indecision. We must assume that the periods of procrastination at the present time have a similar origin. He withdraws from society, is depressed, and dawdles away his time until the situation becomes dangerous. Then he forces himself into action. He works for a time, and as soon as the job is underway, he loses interest in it and slips back into his leisurely life in which he does nothing except what he is forced to do or likes to do. Now, of course, it is no longer hunger that drives him to work, but another motive, even more powerful, of which he is not fully conscious. The nature of this motive will be discussed in the next section. As one surveys Hitler's behavior patterns as his close associates observe them, one gets the impression that this is not a single personality, but two which inhabit the same body and alternate back and forth. The one is a very soft, sentimental, and indecisive individual, has very little drive, and wants nothing quite so much as to be amused, liked, and looked after. The other is just the opposite, a hard, cruel, and decisive person with considerable energy, who seems to know what he wants and is ready to go after it and get it regardless of cost. It is the first Hitler who weeps profusely at the death of his canary, and the second Hitler who cries in open court, "Heads will roll." It is the first Hitler who cannot bring himself to discharge an assistant, and it is the second Hitler who can order the murder of hundreds, including his best friends, and can say with great conviction, "There will be no peace in the land until a body hangs from every lamp post." It is the first Hitler who spends his evenings watching movies or going to cabarets, and it is the second Hitler who works for days on end with little or no sleep, making plans which will affect the destiny of nations. Until we understand the magnitude and implications of this duality in his nature, we can never understand his actions. It is a kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde personality structure in which two wholly different personalities oscillate back and forth and make the individual almost unrecognizable. This characteristic is common to many hysterics. Under these circumstances, it is extremely difficult to predict from one moment to the next what his reactions to a given situation are going to be. An illustration may be helpful. According to Russell, extravagant preparations were made for the commemorative services for the Germans who died when the battleship Deutschland was bombed. Hitler spoke long and passionately to those attending, as well as over the radio. It was then arranged that he should walk down the line of survivors and review the infantry and naval units drawn up at attention. Newsreel cameramen were stationed at all crucial points. Quote, "The first widow to whom Hitler spoke a few words cried violently. Her child, who was 10 years old, and who stood next to his bereaved mother, began to cry heart-rendingly. Hitler patted him on the head and turned uncertainly to the next in line. Before he could speak a word, he was suddenly overcome. He spun completely around, left the carefully prepared program flat. Followed by his utterly surprised companions, he walked as fast as he could to his car and had himself driven away from the parade grounds." Unquote. This sudden alteration from one to the other is not uncommon. Close writes, "Close associates have commented on it time and time again." Ludica writes, quote, "There were times when he gave an impression of unhappiness, of loneliness, of inward searching, but in a moment he would turn again to whatever frenzied task, with the swift command of a man born for action." Unquote. Rauschening, quote, "Almost anything might suddenly inflame his wrath and hatred, but equally the transition from anger to sentimentality or enthusiasm might be quite sudden." Unquote. Huddleston writes, quote, "His eyes, soft and dreamy as he spoke to me, suddenly flashed and hardened." Unquote. Voigt says, quote, "Close collaborators for many years said that Hitler was always like this. The slightest difficulty or obstacle could make him scream with rage or burst into tears." Unquote. Haydn has commented upon the duality of Hitler's character and has suggested that the procrastinating side is Hitler, while the fiery personality which erupts from time to time is the Führer. Although this may not be strictly true from a psychological point of view, it may be helpful to think of them in these terms. There is not, however, a complete disassociation from the personality. In such a case, we would expect to find personalities alternating with each other quite beyond the voluntary control of the individual. This is clearly not the case with Hitler, who can adopt either role more or less at will. At least he is able, on occasion, to induce the Führer personality to come into existence when the occasion demands. This is what he does at almost every speech. At the beginning, as previously mentioned, he is nervous and insecure on the platform. At times he has considerable difficulty in finding anything to say. This is Hitler. But under these circumstances, the Hitler personality does not usually predominate for any length of time. As soon as he gets the feel of the audience, the tempo of the speech increases, and the Führer personality begins to assert itself. Haydn says, quote, "The stream of speech stiffens him like a stream of water stiffens a hose." Unquote. As he speaks, he seduces himself into believing that he is actually and fundamentally the Führer, or as Rauschening says, he doses himself with the morphine of his own verbiage. It is this transformation of the little Hitler into the great Führer, which takes place under the eyes of his audience, which probably fascinates them. By complicated psychological processes, they are able to identify themselves with him, and as the speech progresses, they themselves are temporarily transformed and inspired. He must also undergo a transformation of this kind when he is expected to make a decision or take definite action. As we have seen, Hitler procrastinates until the situation becomes dangerous and intolerable. When he can procrastinate no longer, he is able to induce the Führer personality to assert itself. Rauschening has put this well, quote, "He is languid and apathetic by nature and needs the stimulus of nervous excitement to rouse him out of chronic lethargy to spasmodic activity. Before Hitler can act, he must lash himself out of lethargy and doubts into a frenzy." Unquote. Having lashed himself into this state of mind, he can play the Führer to perfection. When the transformation takes place in his personality, all his views, sentiments, and values are also transformed. The result is that, as Führer, he can make statements with great conviction which flatly contradict what Hitler said a few minutes earlier. He can grapple with the most important problems and in a few minutes reduce them to extremely simple terms. He can map out campaigns, be the supreme judge, deal with diplomats, ignore all ethical and moral principles, order executions or the destruction of cities without the slightest hesitation. And he can be in the best humor while he was doing it. All of this would have been completely impossible for Hitler. Hitler likes to believe that this is his true self, and he has made every effort to convince the German people that it is his only self. But it is an artifact. The whole Führer personality is a grossly exaggerated and distorted conception of masculinity as Hitler conceives it. The Führer personality shows all the earmarks of a reaction formation which has been created unconsciously as a compensation and cover-up for deep-lying tendencies which he despises. This mechanism is very frequently found in hysterics and always serves the purpose of repudiating the true self by creating an image which is diametrically opposite and then identifying oneself with the image. The great difference between Hitler and thousands of other hysterics is that he has managed to convince millions of people that the fictitious image is really himself. The more he was able to convince them, the more he became convinced of it himself. on the theory that 80 million Germans can't be wrong. And so he has fallen in love with the image he himself created and does his utmost to forget that behind it there is quite another Hitler who is a very despicable fellow. It is his ability to convince others that he is what he isn't that has saved him from insanity. This psychological maneuver, however, is never entirely successful. Secret fears and anxieties that belie the reality of the image keep cropping up to shake his confidence and security. He may rationalize these fears or displace them, but they continue to haunt him. Some are at least partially justified, others seem to be groundless. For example, he has had a fear of cancer for many years. Ordinarily, he fears that he has a cancer in his stomach, since he is always bothered with indigestion, and all the assurances of his doctors have not been sufficient to dispel this fear. A few years ago, a simple polyp grew on his larynx. Immediately, his fear shifted to the throat, and he was sure that he had developed a throat cancer. When Dr. von Eichen diagnosed it as a simple polyp, Hitler at first refused to believe it. Then he has fears of being poisoned, fears of being assassinated, fears of losing his health, fears of gaining weight, fears of treason, fears of losing his mystical guidance, fears of anesthetics, fears of premature death, fears that his mission will not be fulfilled, etc. Every conceivable precaution must be taken to reduce these dangers, real and imagined, to a minimum. In later years, the fear of betrayal and possibly assassination by one of his associates seems to have grown considerably. Thiessen claims that it has reached the point where he no longer trusts the Gestapo. Frank reports that even the generals must surrender their swords before they are admitted into conferences with him. Sleep is no longer a refuge from his fears. He wakes up in the night shaking and screaming. Rauschening claims that one of Hitler's close associates told him that, quote, Hitler wakes at night with convulsive shrieks, shouts for help. He sits on the edge of his bed as if unable to stir. He shakes with fear, making the whole bed vibrate. He shouts confused, unintelligible phrases. He gasps, as if imagining himself to be suffocating. On one occasion, Hitler stood swaying in his room, looking wildly about him. He's been here, he gasped. His lips were blue. Sweat streamed down his face. Suddenly he began to reel off figures and odd words and broken phrases, entirely devoid of sense. It sounded horrible. He used strangely composed and entirely un-German word formations. Then he stood still, only his lips moving. Then he suddenly broke out, There, in the corner, who's that? He stamped and shrieked in the familiar way, unquote. Zeisler also reports such incidents. It would seem that Hitler's late hours are very likely due to the fact that he is afraid to go to sleep. The result of these fears, as it is with almost every hysteric, is a narrowing of the world in which he lives. Haunted by secret misgivings, he distrusts everybody, even those closest to him. He cannot establish any close friendships for fear of being betrayed or being discovered as he really is. As his world becomes more and more circumscribed, he becomes lonelier and lonelier. He feels himself to be a captive and often compares his life with that of the Pope. Fry says spiritual loneliness must be Hitler's secret regret, and von Wiegen writes, quote, Perhaps the snow-crowned peaks of the Alps glistened in the moonlight, remind Adolf Hitler of the glittering but cold, lonely heights of fame and achievement to which he has climbed. I am the loneliest man on earth, he said to an employee of his household, unquote. Hysterics, however, are not discouraged by all this. On the contrary, they interpret their fears as proof of their own importance rather than as signs of their fundamental weakness. As Hitler's personal world becomes smaller, he must extend the boundaries of his physical domains. Meanwhile, his image of himself must become ever more inflated in order to compensate for his deprivations and the maintenance of his repressions. He must build bigger and better buildings, bridges, stadia, and whatnot, as tangible symbols of his power and greatness, and then use these as evidence that he really is what he wants to believe he is. There is, however, little gratification in all this. No matter what he achieves or what he does, it is never sufficient to convince him that things are what they seem to be. He is always insecure and must bolster up his superstructure by new acquisitions and more defenses. But the more he gets and the higher he builds, the more he has to worry about and defend. He is caught in a vicious circle, like so many other hysterics, which grows bigger and bigger as time goes on, but never brings them the sense of security they crave above everything else. The reason for this is that they are barking up the wrong tree. The security they seek is not to be found in the outside world, but in themselves. Had they conquered their own unsocial impulses, their real enemy, while they were young, they would not need to struggle with such subterfuges when they are mature. The dangers they fear in the world around them are only the shadows of the dangers they fear will creep up on them from within if they do not maintain a strict vigilance over their actions. Repudiation is not synonymous to annihilation. These unsocial impulses, like termites, gnaw away at the foundations of the personality, and the higher the superstructure is built, the shakier it becomes. In most hysterics, these unsocial impulses, which they consciously regard as dangers, have been fairly successfully repressed. The individual may feel himself to be despicable without being conscious of the whys and wherefores of this feeling. The origins of the feeling remain almost wholly unconscious or are camouflaged in such a way that they are not obvious to the individual himself. In Hitler's case, however, this is not so, at least not entirely. He has good cause for feeling himself to be despicable, and he is partially aware of its origins. The repression has not been completely successful, and consequently some of the unsocial tendencies do from time to time assert themselves and demand satisfaction. Hitler's sexual life has always been the topic of much speculation. As pointed out in the previous section, most of his closest associates are absolutely ignorant on the subject. This has led to conjectures of all sorts. Some believe that he is entirely immune from such impulses. Some believe that he is a chronic masturbator. Some believe that he derives his sexual pleasure through voyeurism. Many believe that he is completely impotent. Others, and these are perhaps in the majority, that he is homosexual. It is probably true that he is impotent, but he is certainly not homosexual in the ordinary sense of the term. His perversion has quite a different nature, which few have guessed. It is an extreme form of masochism, in which the individual derives sexual gratification from the act of having a woman urinate or defecate on him. Although this perversion is not a common one, it is not unknown in clinical work, particularly in its incipient stages. The 4 collaborators on this study, in addition to Dr. D. Saussure, who learned of the perversion from other sources, have all had experience with cases of this type. All 5 agree that the information as given is probably true in view of their clinical experience and their knowledge of Hitler's character. In the following section, further evidence of its validity will be cited together with the consideration of the influence it has had on his personality and actions. At the present time, it is sufficient to recognize that these tendencies represent a constant threat to him, which disturbs the equilibrium of his conscious mental life. Not only must he be continually on his guard against any overt manifestation, but he must struggle with the intolerable feelings of guilt which are generated by his secret and unwelcome desires. These, together with his fears, haunt him day and night, and incapacitate him as far as consistent and constructive work is concerned. Surely Hitler has externalized his own problem and its supposed solution when he writes, quote, "Only when the time comes when the race is no longer overshadowed by the consciousness of its own guilt, then it will find internal peace and external energy to cut down, regardlessly and brutally, the wild shoots and to pull up the weeds," unquote. Part 5. Psychological Analysis and Reconstruction. The world has come to know Adolf Hitler for his insatiable greed for power, his ruthlessness, cruelty, and utter lack of feeling, his contempt for established institutions, and his lack of moral restraints. In the course of relatively few years, he has contrived to usurp such tremendous power that a few veiled threats, accusations, or insinuations were sufficient to make the world tremble. In open defiance of treaties, he occupied huge territories and conquered millions of people without even firing a shot. When the world became tired of being frightened and concluded that it was all a bluff, he initiated the most brutal and devastating war in history, a war which, for a time, threatened the complete destruction of our civilization. Human life and human suffering seem to leave this individual completely untouched as he plunges along the course he believes he was predestined to take. Earlier in his career, the world had watched him with amusement. Many people refused to take him seriously on the grounds that he could not possibly last. As one action after another met with amazing success, and the measure of the man became more obvious, this amusement was transformed into incredulousness. To most people, it seemed inconceivable that such things could actually happen in our modern civilization. Hitler, the leader of these activities, became generally regarded as a madman, if not inhuman. Such a judgment concerning the nature of our enemy may be satisfactory to the man in the street. It gives him a feeling of satisfaction to pigeonhole an incomprehensible individual in one category or another, and having classified him in this way, he feels that the problem is solved. All we need to do is eliminate the madman from the scene of activities, replace him with a sane individual, and the world will again return to a normal and peaceful state of affairs. This naive view, however, is wholly inadequate for those who are delegated to conduct the war against Germany, or for those who will be delegated to deal with the situation when the war is over. They cannot content themselves with simply regarding Hitler as a personal devil and condemning him to an eternal hell in order that the remainder of the world may live in peace and quiet. They will realize that the madness of the Führer has become the madness of a nation, if not a large part of the continent. They will realize that these are not wholly the actions of a single individual, but that a reciprocal relationship exists between the Führer and the people, and that the madness of one stimulates and flows into the other, and vice versa. It was not only Hitler, the madman, who created German madness, but German madness which created Hitler. Having created him as its spokesman and leader, it has been carried along by his momentum, perhaps far beyond the point where it was originally prepared to go. Nevertheless, it continues to follow his lead, in spite of the fact that it must be obvious to all intelligent people now that his path leads to inevitable destruction. From a scientific point of view, therefore, we are forced to consider Hitler the Führer not as a personal devil, wicked as his actions and philosophy may be, but as the expression of a state of mind existing in millions of people, not only in Germany, but to a smaller degree in all civilized countries. To remove Hitler may be a necessary first step, but it would not be the cure. It would be analogous to removing a canker without treating the underlying disease. If similar eruptions are to be prevented in the future, we cannot content ourselves with simply removing the overt manifestations of the disease. On the contrary, we must ferret out and seek to correct the underlying factors which produced the unwelcome phenomenon. We must discover the psychological streams which nourish this destructive state of mind, in order that we may divert them into channels which will permit a further evolution of our form of civilization. The present study is concerned wholly with Adolf Hitler and the social forces which impinged upon him in the course of his development and produced the man we know. One may question the wisdom of studying the psychology of a single individual if the present war represents a rebellion by a nation against our civilization. To understand the one does not tell us anything about the millions of others. In a sense, this is perfectly true. In the process of growing up, we are all faced with highly individual experiences and exposed to varying social influences. The result is that when we mature, no two of us are identical from a psychological point of view. In the present instance, however, we are concerned not so much with distinct individuals as with a whole cultural group. The members of this group have been exposed to social influences, family patterns, methods of training and education, opportunities for development, etc., which are fairly homogeneous within a given culture or strata of a culture. The result is that the members of a given culture tend to act, think, and feel more or less alike, at least in contrast to the members of a different cultural group. This justifies to some extent our speaking of a general cultural character. On the other hand, if a large section of a given culture rebels against the traditional pattern, then we must assume that new social influences have been introduced which tend to produce a type of character which cannot thrive in the old cultural environment. When this happens, it may be extremely helpful to understand the nature of the social forces which influence the development of individual members of the group. These may serve as clues to an understanding of the group as a whole, inasmuch as we can then investigate the frequency and intensity of these same forces in the group and draw deductions concerning their effect upon its individual members. If the individual being studied happens to be the leader of the group, we can expect to find the pertinent factors in an exaggerated form which would tend to make them stand out in sharper relief than would be the case if we studied an average member of the group. Under these circumstances, the action of the forces may more easily be isolated and subjected to detailed study in relation to the personality as a whole, as well as to the culture in general. The problem of our study should be then not only whether Hitler is mad or not, but what influences in his development have made him what he is. If we scan the tremendous quantities of material and information which have been accumulated on Hitler, we find little which is helpful in explaining why he is what he is. One can, of course, make general statements, as many authors have done, and say, for example, that his 5 years in Vienna were so frustrating that he hated the whole social order and is now taking his revenge for the injustices he suffered. Such explanations sound very plausible at first glance, but we would also want to know why, as a young man, he was unwilling to work when he had the opportunity, and what happened to transform the lazy Vienna beggar into the energetic politician who never seemed to tire from rushing from one meeting to another and who was able to work thousands of listeners into a state of frenzy. We would also like to know something about the origins of his peculiar working habits at the present time, his firm belief in his mission, and so on. No matter how long we study the available material, we can find no rational explanation for his present conduct. The material is descriptive and tells us a great deal about how he behaves under varying circumstances, what he thinks and feels about various subjects, but it does not tell us why. To be sure, he himself sometimes offers explanations for his conduct, but it is obvious that these are either built upon flimsy, rational foundations, or else they serve to push the problem further back into his past. On this level, we are in exactly the same position in which we find ourselves when a neurotic patient first comes for help. In the case of an individual neurotic patient, however, we can ask for a great deal more first-hand information, which gradually enables us to trace the development of his irrational attitudes or behavioral patterns to earlier experiences or influences in his life history and the effects of these on his later behavior. In most cases, the patient will have forgotten these earlier experiences, but nevertheless, he still uses them as premises in his present conduct. As soon as we are able to understand the premises underlying his conduct, then his irrational behavior becomes comprehensible to us. The same finding would probably hold in Hitler's case, except that here we do not have the opportunity of obtaining the additional first-hand information which would enable us to trace the history of his views and behavioral patterns to their early origins in order to discover the premises upon which he is operating. Hitler's early life, when his fundamental attitudes were undoubtedly formed, is a closely guarded secret, particularly as far as he himself is concerned. He has been extremely careful and has told us exceedingly little about this period of his life, and even that is open to serious questioning. A few fragments have, however, been unearthed, which are helpful in reconstructing his past life and the experiences and influences which have determined his adult character. Nevertheless, in themselves, they would be wholly inadequate for our purposes. Fortunately, there are other sources of information. One of them is Hitler himself. In every utterance, a speaker or writer unknowingly tells us a great deal about himself, of which he is entirely unaware. The subjects he chooses for elaboration frequently reveal unconscious factors, which make these seem more important to him than many other aspects, which would be just as appropriate to the occasion. Furthermore, the method of treatment, together with the attitudes expressed towards certain topics, usually reflect unconscious processes, which are symbolically related to his own problems. The examples he chooses for purposes of illustration almost always contain elements from his own earlier experiences, which were instrumental in cultivating the view he is expounding. The figures of speech he employs reflect unconscious conflicts, and linkages to the incidents of particular types or topics can almost be used as a measure of his preoccupation with problems related to them. A number of experimental techniques have been worked out which bear witness to the validity of these methods of gathering information about the mental life, conscious and unconscious, of an individual in addition to the findings of psychoanalysts and psychiatrists. Then, too, we have our practical experience in studying patients whose difficulties were not unlike those we find in Hitler. Our knowledge of the origins of these difficulties may be often used to evaluate conflicting information, check deductions concerning what probably happened, or fill in gaps where no information is available. It may be possible with the help of all these sources of information to reconstruct the outstanding events in his early life, which have determined his present behavior and character structure. Our study must, however, of necessity be speculative and inconclusive. It may tell us a great deal about the mental processes of our subject, but it cannot be as comprehensive or conclusive as the findings of a direct study conducted with the cooperation of the individual. Nevertheless, the situation is such that even an indirect study of this kind is warranted. Freud's earliest and greatest contribution to psychiatry in particular, and to an understanding of human conduct in general, was his discovery of the importance of the first years of a child's life in shaping his future character. It is during these early years, when the child's acquaintanceship with the world is still meager and his capacities are still undeveloped, that the chances of misinterpreting the nature of the world about him are the greatest. The mind of the child is inadequate for understanding the demands which a complex culture makes upon him, or the host of confusing experiences to which he is exposed. In consequence, as has been shown over and over again, a child during his early years frequently misinterprets what is going on about him and builds his personality structure on false premises. Even Hitler concedes that this finding is true, for he says in Mein Kampf, quote, "There is a boy, let us say, of 3. This is the age at which a child becomes conscious of his first impressions. In many intelligent people, traces of these early memories are found even in old age." Unquote. Under these circumstances, it will be well for us to inquire into the nature of Hitler's earliest environment and the impressions on which he probably formed during this period. Our factual information on this phase of his life is practically nil. In Mein Kampf, Hitler tries to create the impression that his home was rather peaceful and quiet, that his father, a faithful civil servant, the mother devoting herself to the cares of the household and looking after her children with eternally the same loving care. It would seem that if this is a true representation of the home environment, there would be no reason for his concealing it so scrupulously. This is the only passage in a book of 1,000 pages in which he even intimates that there were other children for his mother to take care of. No brother and no sister are mentioned in any other connection, and even to his associates he has never admitted that there were other children besides his half-sister Angela. Very little more is said about his mother, either in writing or speaking. This concealment in itself would make us suspicious about the truth of the statement quoted above. We become even more suspicious when we find that not a single patient manifesting Hitler's character traits has grown up in such a well-ordered and peaceful home environment. If we read on in Mein Kampf, we find that Hitler gives us a description of a child's life in a lower-class family. He says, quote, "Among the 5 children there is a boy, let us say, of 3. When the parents fight almost daily, their brutality leaves nothing to the imagination. Then the results of such visual education must slowly but inevitably become apparent to the little one. Those who are not familiar with such conditions can hardly imagine the results, especially when the mutual differences express themselves in the form of brutal attacks on the part of the father towards the mother, or to assaults due to drunkenness. The poor little boy, at the age of 6, senses things which would make even a grown-up person shudder. The other things the little fellow hears at home do not tend to further his respect for his surroundings." Unquote. In view of the fact that we now know that there were 5 children in the Hitler home, and that his father liked to spend his spare time in the village tavern, where he sometimes drank so heavily that he had to be brought home by his wife or children, we begin to suspect that in this passage Hitler is, in all probability, describing conditions in his own home as a child. If we accept the hypothesis that Hitler is actually talking about his own home when he describes conditions in the average lower-class family, we can obtain further information concerning the nature of his home environment. We read, quote, "Things end badly, indeed, when the man from the very start goes his own way, and the wife, for the sake of the children, stands up against him. Quarreling and nagging set in, and in the same measure in which the husband becomes estranged from his wife, he becomes familiar with alcohol. When he finally comes home, drunk and brutal, but always without a last cent or penny, then God have mercy on the scenes which follow. I witnessed all this personally in hundreds of scenes, and at the beginning, with both disgust and indignation." Unquote. When we remember the few friends that Hitler has made in the course of his life, and not a single intimate friend, one wonders where he had the opportunity of observing these scenes personally, hundreds of times, if it was not in his own home. And then he continues, unquote, to quote, "The other things the little fellow hears at home do not tend to further his respect for his surroundings. Not a single good shred is left for humanity. Not a single institution is left unattacked. Starting with the teacher up to the head of the state, be it religion or morality as such, be it the state or society, no matter which, everything is pulled down in the nastiest manner into the filth of a depraved mentality." Unquote. All of this agrees with information obtained from other sources, whose veracity might otherwise be open to question. With this as corroborating evidence, however, it seems safe to assume that the above passages are a fairly accurate picture of the Hitler household, and we may surmise that these scenes did arouse disgust and indignation in him at a very early age. These feelings were aggravated by the fact that when his father was sober, he tried to create an entirely different impression. At such times he stood very much in his dignity and prided himself on his position in the civil service. Even after he had retired from this service, he always insisted on wearing his uniform when he appeared in public. He was scrupulous about his appearance and strode down the village street in his most dignified manner. When he spoke to his neighbors or acquaintances, he did so in a very condescending manner, and always demanded that they use his full title when they addressed him. If one of them happened to omit a part of it, he would call attention to their omission. He carried this to the point where, so informants tell us, he became a source of amusement to the other villagers and their children. At home, he demanded that the children address him as Herr Vater, instead of using one of the intimate abbreviations or nicknames that children commonly do. Father's influence on Hitler's character. We know from our study of many cases that the character of the father is one of the major factors determining the character of the child, particularly that of a boy. In cases in which the father is a fairly well-integrated individual and presents a consistent pattern of behavior which the small boy can respect, he becomes a model which the child strives to emulate. The image of the child has of his father becomes the cornerstone of his later character structure, and with its help he is able to integrate his own behavior along socially accepted lines. The importance of this first step in character development can scarcely be overestimated. It is almost a prerequisite for a stable, secure, and well-integrated personality in later life. In Hitler's case, as in almost all other neurotics of his type, this step was not feasible. Instead of presenting an image of a consistent, harmonious, and socially adjusted and admirable individual, which the child could use as a guide and model, the father showed himself to be a mass of contradictions. At times he played the role of a faithful civil servant who respected his position in the society he served and demanded that all others do likewise. At such times he was the soul of dignity, propriety, sternness, and justice. To the outside world he tried to appear as a pillar of society who all should respect and obey. At home, on the other hand, particularly after he had been drinking, he appeared the exact opposite. He was brutal, unjust, and inconsiderate. He had no respect for anybody or anything. The world was all wrong and an unfit place in which to live. At such times he also played the part of the bully and whipped his wife and children who were unable to defend themselves. Even the dog comes in for his share of this sadistic display. Under such circumstances the child becomes confused and is unable to identify himself with a clear-cut pattern, which he can use as a guide for his own adjustment. Not only is this a severe handicap in itself, but in addition the child is given a distorted picture of the world around him and the nature of the people in it. The home, during those years, is his world, and later he judges the outside world in terms of it. In Hitler's case, we would expect that the whole world would appear as extremely dangerous, uncertain, and unjust, and the child's impulse would be to avoid it as far as possible, because he felt unable to cope with it. His feelings of insecurity would be enhanced inasmuch as he could never predict beforehand how his father would behave when he came home, or what he could expect from him. The person who should give him love, support, and a feeling of security fills him with anxiety, uneasiness, and uncertainty. His search for a competent guide. As a child, Hitler must have felt this lack very keenly, for throughout his later life we find him searching for a strong masculine figure who he can respect and emulate. The men with whom he had contact during his childhood evidently could not fill the role of guide to his complete satisfaction. There is some evidence that he attempted to regard some of his teachers in this way, but whether it was the influence of his father's ranting or the shortcomings of the teachers themselves, his attempts always miscarried. Later he attempted to find great men in history who could fill this need. Caesar, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great are only a few of the legion to whom he became attached. Although historic figures serve as an important role of this kind in the life of almost every child, they are in themselves inadequate. Unless a fairly solid foundation already exists in the mind of the child, these heroes never become flesh and blood people inasmuch as the relationship is one-sided and lacks reciprocation. The same is also true of the political figures with which Hitler sought to identify himself during the Vienna period. For a time, Schonerer and Luger became his heroes, and although they were instrumental in forming some of his political beliefs and channeling his feelings, they were still too far removed from him to play the role of permanent guides and models. During his career in the army, we have an excellent example of Hitler's willingness to submit to the leadership of strong males who were willing to guide him and protect him. Throughout his army life, there is not a shred of evidence to show that Hitler was anything but the model soldier as far as submissiveness and obedience are concerned. From a psychological point of view, his life in the army was a kind of substitute for the home life he had always wanted but could never find, and he fulfilled his duties willingly and faithfully. He liked it so well that after he was wounded in 1916, he wrote to his commanding officer and requested that he be called back to front duty before his leave had expired. After the close of the war, he stayed in the army and continued to be docile to his officers. He was willing to do anything they asked, even to the point of spying on his own comrades and then condemning them to death. When his officers singled him out to do special propaganda work, because they believed he had a talent for speaking, he was overjoyed. This was the beginning of his political career, and here too we can find many manifestations of his search for a leader. In the beginning he may have well thought of himself as the drummer boy who was heralding the coming of the great leader. Certain it is that during the early years of his career he was very submissive to a succession of important men to whom he looked for guidance, von Kahr, Ludendorff, and Hindenburg, to name only a few. It is true that in the end he turned upon them one after another and treated them in a despicable fashion, but usually this change came after he discovered their personal shortcomings and inadequacies. As in many neurotic people of Hitler's type who have a deep craving for guidance from an older man, their requirements grow with the years. By the time they reach maturity, they are looking for, and can only submit to, a person who is perfect in every respect, literally a Superman. The result is that they were always trying to come in contact with new persons of high status in the hope that each one will, in turn, prove to be the ideal. No sooner do they discover a single weakness or shortcoming than they depose him from the pedestal on which they have placed him. They then treat their fallen heroes badly for having failed to live up to their expectations. And so Hitler has spent his life looking for a competent guide, but always ends up with the discovery that the person he has chosen falls short of his requirements and is fundamentally no more capable than himself. That this tendency is a carry-over from his early childhood is evidenced by the fact that throughout these years he has always laid great stress on addressing these persons by their full titles, shades of his father's training during early childhood. It may be of interest to note that at this time, that all of the titles that Hitler might have chosen for himself, he is content with the simple one of Führer. To him this title is the greatest of them all. He has spent his life searching for a person worthy of the role, but was unable to find one until he discovered himself. His goal now is to fulfill this role to millions of other people in a way in which he had hoped some person might do for him. The fact that the German people have submitted so readily to his leadership would indicate that a great many Germans were in a similar state of mind as Hitler himself, and were not only willing, but anxious, to submit to anybody who could prove to them that he was competent to fill the role. There is some sociological evidence that this is probably so, and that its origins lie in the structure of the German family and the dual role played by the father within the home as contrasted with the outside world. The duality, on the average, is, of course, not nearly as marked as we have shown it to be in Hitler's case, but it may be this very fact which qualified him to identify the need and express it in terms which the others could understand and accept. There is evidence that the only person in the world at the present time who might challenge Hitler in the role of leader is Roosevelt. Informants are agreed that he fears neither Churchill nor Stalin. He feels that they are sufficiently like himself, so that he can understand their psychology and defeat them at the game. Roosevelt, however, seems to be an enigma to him. How a man can lead a nation of 130 million people and keep them in line without a great deal of name-calling, shouting, abusing, and threatening is a mystery to him. He is unable to understand how a man can be the leader of a large group and still act like a gentleman. The result is that he secretly admires Roosevelt to a considerable degree, regardless of what he publicly says about him. Underneath, he probably fears him inasmuch as he is unable to predict his actions. Hitler's mother and her influence. Hitler's father, however, was only a part of his early environment. There was also his mother, who, from all reports, was a very decent type of woman. Hitler has written very little and said nothing about her publicly. Informants tell us, however, that she was an extremely conscientious and hard-working individual whose life centered around her home and children. She was an exemplary housekeeper, and there was never a spot or speck of dust to be found in the house. Everything was very neat and orderly. She was a very devout Catholic, and the trials and tribulations that fell upon her home she accepted with Christian resignation. Even her last illness, which extended over many months and caused her great pain, she endured without a single complaint. We may assume that she had to put up with much from her irascible husband, and it may be that at times she did have to stand up against him for the welfare of her children. But all of this she probably accepted in the same spirit of abnegation. To her own children she was always extremely affectionate and generous, although there is some reason to suppose that she was mean at times to her two stepchildren. In any event, every scrap of evidence indicates that there was an extremely strong attachment between herself and Adolph. As previously pointed out, this was due in part to the fact that she had lost 2, or possibly 3, children before Adolph was born. Since he too was frail as a child, it is natural that a woman of her type should do everything within her power to guard against another recurrence of her earlier experiences. The result was that she catered to his whims, even to the point of spoiling him, and that she was overprotective in her attitude towards him. We may assume that during the first 5 years of Adolph's life, he was the apple of his mother's eye, and that she lavished affection upon him. In view of her husband's conduct and the fact that he was 23 years her senior, and far from having a loving disposition, we may suppose that much of the affection that normally would have gone to him also found its way to Adolph. The result was a strong libidinal attachment between mother and son. It is almost certain that Adolph had temper tantrums during this time, but these were not of a serious nature. Their immediate purpose was to get his own way with his mother, and he undoubtedly succeeded in achieving this end. They were a technique by which he could dominate her whenever he wished, either out of fear that she would lose his love, or out of fear that if he continued, he might become like his father. There is reason to suppose that she frequently condoned behavior of which the father would have disapproved, and may have become a partner in forbidden activities during the father's absence. Life with his mother during these early years must have been a veritable paradise for Adolph, except for the fact that his father would intrude and disrupt the happy relationship. Even when his father did not make a scene or lift his whip, he would demand attention from his wife, which prevented her participation in pleasurable activities. It was natural under these circumstances that Adolph should resent the intrusion into his paradise, and this undoubtedly aggravated the feelings of uncertainty and fear which his father's conduct aroused in him. As he became older and the libidinal attachment to his mother became stronger, both the resentment and fear undoubtedly increased. Infantile sexual feelings were probably quite prominent in this relationship, as well as fantasies of a childish nature. This is the Oedipus complex mentioned by psychologists and psychiatrists who have written about Hitler's personality. The great amount of affection lavished upon him by his mother and the undesirable character of his father served to develop this complex to an extraordinary degree. The more he hated his father, the more dependent he became upon the affection and love of his mother, and the more he loved his mother, the more afraid he became of his father's vengeance, should his secret be discovered. Under these circumstances, little boys frequently fantasy about ways and means of ridding the environment of the intruder. There is reason to suppose that this also happened in Hitler's early life. Influences determining his attitude towards love, women, marriage. 2 other factors entered into the situation which served to accentuate the conflict still further. One of these was the birth of a baby brother when he was 5 years of age. This introduced a new rival onto the scene and undoubtedly deprived him of some of his mother's affection and attention, particularly since the new child was also rather sickly. We may suppose that the newcomer in the family also became the victim of Adolph's animosity, and that he fantasized about getting rid of him as he had earlier contemplated getting rid of his father. There was nothing abnormal in this except the intensity of the emotions involved. The other factor which served to intensify these feelings was the fact that as a child he must have discovered his parents during intercourse. An examination of the data makes this conclusion almost inescapable, and from our knowledge of his father's character and past history, it is not at all improbable. It would seem that his feelings on this occasion were very mixed. On the one hand, he was indignant at his father for what he considered to be a brutal assault upon his mother. On the other hand, he was indignant with his mother because she submitted so willingly to the father, and he was indignant with himself because he was powerless to intervene. Later, as we shall see, there was an hysterical reliving of this experience, which played an important part in shaping his future destinies. Being a spectator to this early scene had many repercussions. One of the most important of these was the fact that he felt that his mother had betrayed him in submitting to his father, a feeling which became accentuated still further when his baby brother was born. He lost much of his respect for the female sex, and while in Vienna, Hanisch reports he frequently spoke at length on the topic of love and marriage, and that, quote, he had very austere ideas about relations between men and women, unquote. Even at that time, he maintained that if men had only wanted to, they could adopt a strictly moral way of living. He often said it was the woman's fault if a man went astray, and he used to lecture us about this, saying every woman can be had. In other words, he regarded women as the seducer and responsible for man's downfall, and he condemned them for their disloyalty. These attitudes are probably the outcome of his early experiences with his mother, who first seduced him into a love relationship and then betrayed him by giving herself to his father. Nevertheless, he still continued to believe in an idealistic form of love and marriage, which would be possible if a loyal woman could be found. As we know, Hitler never gave himself into the hands of a woman again, with the possible exception of his niece, Kelly Raubel, which also ended in disaster. Outside of that single exception, he has lived a loveless life. His distrust of both men and women is so deep that in all his history there is no record of a really intimate and lasting friendship. The outcome of these early experiences was probably a feeling of being very much alone in a hostile world. He hated his father for his brutality, he distrusted his mother for her lack of loyalty, and despised himself for his weakness. The immature child finds such a state of mind almost unendurable for any length of time, and in order to gain peace and security in his environment, these feelings are gradually repressed from his memory. This is a normal procedure which happens in the case of every child at a relatively early age. This process of repression enables the child to reestablish a more or less friendly relationship with his parents without the interference of disturbing memories or emotions. The early conflicts, however, are not solved or destroyed by such a process, and we must expect to find manifestations of them later on. When the early repression has been fairly adequate, these conflicts lie dormant until adolescence, when, due to the process of maturation, they are reawakened. In some cases they reappear in very much their original form, while in others they are expressed in a camouflaged or symbolic form. In Hitler's case, however, the conflicting emotions and sentiments were so strong that they could not be held in complete abeyance during this entire period. Quite early in his school career, we find his conflicts appearing again in symbolic form. Unfortunately, the symbols he unconsciously chose to express his own inner conflicts were such that they have seriously affected the future of the world, and yet these symbols fit his peculiar situation so perfectly that it was almost inevitable that they would be chosen as vehicles of expression. Early conflicts expressed in symbolic form. Unconsciously, all the emotions he had once felt for his mother became transferred to Germany. This transfer of affect was relatively easy, inasmuch as Germany, like his mother, was young and vigorous, and held great promise of a great future under suitable circumstances. Furthermore, he felt shut off from Germany, as he now felt shut off from his mother, even though he secretly wished to be with her. Germany became a symbol of his ideal mother, and his sentiments are clearly expressed in his writings and speeches. A few excerpts will serve to illustrate the transfer of emotion. Quote, "The longing grew stronger to go there, Germany, where since my early youth I had been drawn by secret wishes and secret love. What I first had looked upon as an impassable chasm now spurred me on to greater love for my country than ever before, an unnatural separation from the great common motherland. I appeal to those who, severed from the motherland, and who now in painful emotion long for the hour that will allow them to return to the arms of the beloved mother." Unquote. It is significant that although Germans as a whole invariably refer to Germany as the fatherland, Hitler almost always refers to it as the motherland. Just as Germany was ideally suited to symbolize his mother, so was Austria ideally suited to symbolize his father. Like his father, Austria was old, exhausted, and decaying from within. He therefore transferred all his unconscious hatred from his father to the Austrian state. He could now give vent to all his pent-up emotions without exposing himself to the dangers he believed he would have encountered had he expressed these same feelings toward the persons really involved. In Mein Kampf, he frequently refers to the Austrian state, for example, in terms such as these, quote, "An intense love for my native German Austrian country and a bitter hatred against the Austrian state. With proud admiration, I compared the rise of the Reich with the decline of the Austrian state." Unquote. The alliance between Austria and Germany served to symbolize the marriage of his mother and father. Over and over again we find references to this alliance, and we can see clearly how deeply he resented the marriage of his parents, because he felt that his father was a detriment to his mother, and only through the death of the former could the latter obtain her freedom and find her salvation. A few quotations will illustrate this sentiment. Quote, "And who could keep faith with an imperial dynasty which betrayed the cause of the German people for its own ignominious ends, a betrayal that occurred again and again? What grieved us most was the fact that the whole system was morally protected by the alliance with Germany, and thus Germany herself walked by the side of the corpse. It suffices to state here that from my earliest youth I came to a conviction which never deserted me, but on the contrary grew stronger and stronger, that the protection of the German race presumed the destruction of Austria, that above all else the royal house of Habsburg was destined to bring misfortune upon the German nation. Since my heart had never beaten for an Austrian monarchy, but only for a German Reich, I could only look upon the hour of the ruin of this state as the beginning of the salvation of the German nation. When we have grasped the significance of this transference of effect, we have made a long step in the direction of understanding Hitler's actions. Unconsciously, he is not dealing with nations composed of millions of individuals, but is trying to solve his personal conflicts and rectify the injustices of his childhood. Unable to enter into a give-and-take relationship with other human beings, which might afford him an opportunity of resolving his conflicts in a realistic manner, he projects his personal problems on great nations, and then tries to solve them on this unrealistic level. His microcosm has been inflated into a macrocosm. We can now understand why Hitler fell on his knees and thanked God when the last war broke out. To him it did not simply mean a war as such, but an opportunity of fighting for his symbolic mother, of proving his manhood, and of being accepted by her. It was inevitable that he would seek enlistment in the German army rather than in the Austrian army, and it was also inevitable under these circumstances that he would be a good and obedient soldier. Unconsciously, it was as though he were a little boy who was playing the part of a man while his mother stood by and watched him. Her future welfare was his great concern, and in order to prove his love he was willing, if need be, to sacrifice his own life for her. His relationship to Germany was, in effect, the sexless, idealistic marriage he longed for. The effects of Germany's defeat. Everything went smoothly as long as he felt sure that all would turn out well in the end. He never complained about the hardships that were imposed on him, and he never grumbled with the other men. He was happy in what he was doing and met the trials and tribulations of army life with his chin up until he discovered that things were going badly and that his symbolic mother was about to be degraded as he had imagined his real mother had been degraded in his childhood. To him it was as if his mother was again the victim of a sexual assault. This time it was the November criminals and the Jews who were guilty of the foul deed, and he promptly transferred his repressed hate to these new perpetrators. When he became fully aware of Germany's defeat, he reacted in a typically hysterical manner. He refused to accept or adjust to the situation on a reality level. Instead, he reacted to this event as he probably reacted to the discovery of his parents in intercourse. He writes, quote, "I stumbled and tottered rearwards with burning eyes. Already a few hours later the eyes had turned into burning coals. It had become dark around me," unquote. And in another place he writes, quote, "While everything began to go black again before my eyes, stumbling, I groped my way back to the dormitory, threw myself on my cot, and buried my burning head in the covers and pillows," unquote. At the time this happened, he had been exposed to a slight attack of mustard gas. He immediately believed that he was blinded and speechless. Although he spent several weeks in the hospital, neither his symptoms nor the development of the illness corresponded to those found in genuine gas cases. It has been definitely established that both the blindness and the mutism were of an hysterical nature. The physician who treated him at the time found that his case so typical of hysterical symptoms in general that for years after the war he used it as an illustration in his courses given at a prominent German medical school. We know from a great many other cases that during the onset of such attacks the patient behaves in exactly the same manner as he did earlier in his life when confronted by a situation with the same emotional content. It is as though the individual were actually reliving an earlier experience over again. In Hitler's case, this earlier experience was almost certainly the discovery of his parents in intercourse, and that he interpreted this as a brutal assault in which he was powerless. He refused to believe what his eyes told him, and the experience left him speechless. That this interpretation is correct is evidenced by his imagery in dealing with the event later on. Over and over again we find figures of speech such as these, quote, "By what wiles the soul of the German has been raped," unquote. "Our German pacifists will pass over in silence the most bloody rape of the nation," unquote, which illustrate his sentiments very clearly. the origins of his belief in his mission, and his longing for immortality. It was while he was in the hospital suffering from hysterical blindness and mutism that he had the vision he would liberate the Germans from their bondage and make Germany great. It was this vision that set him on his present political career, and which has had such a determining influence on the course of world events. More than anything else, it was this vision which convinced him that he was chosen by Providence and that he had a great mission to perform. This is probably the most outstanding characteristic of Hitler's mature personality, and it is this which guides him with the precision of a sleepwalker. From an analysis of many other cases, we know that such convictions never result from an adult experience alone. In order to carry conviction, they must reawaken the earlier beliefs which have their roots far back in childhood. It is, of course, nothing unusual for a child to believe that he is some special creation and destined to do great things before he dies. One can almost say that every child passes through such a period on his way to growing up. In many people, remnants of such early beliefs are observable inasmuch as they feel or believe that fate or luck or providence or some other extra-natural power has chosen them for special favors. In most of these cases, however, the adult individual only half believes that this is really even so, when a whole series of favorable events may make the hypothesis plausible. Only rarely do we find a firm conviction of this kind in adulthood, and then only when there were extenuating circumstances in childhood which made such a belief necessary and convincing. In Hitler's case, the extenuating circumstances are relatively clear. Mention has already been made of the fact that his mother had given birth to at least 2 and possibly 3 children, all of whom had died prior to his own birth. He himself was a frail and rather sickly infant. Under these circumstances, his mother undoubtedly exerted herself to the utmost to keep him alive. He was unquestionably spoiled during this period, and his survival was probably the great concern of the family as well as of the neighbors. From his earliest days there was, no doubt, considerable talk in the household about the death of the other children and constant comparisons between their progress and his own. Children first become aware of death as a phenomenon very early in life, and in view of these unusual circumstances, it may have dawned on Hitler even earlier than with most children. The thought of death itself is inconceivable to a small child, and usually they are able to form only the vaguest conception of what it means or implies before they push it out of their minds for later consideration. In Hitler's case, however, it was a living issue, and the fears of the mother were in all likelihood communicated to him. As he pondered the problem in his immature way, he probably wondered why the others died while he continued to live. The natural conclusion for a child to draw was that he was favored in some way, or that he was chosen to live for some particular purpose. The belief that he was the chosen one would have been reinforced by the fact that, as far as his mother was concerned, he was very much the chosen one in comparison with her 2 stepchildren who were also living in the home at the time. This belief must have been strengthened considerably when, at the age of 5, his baby brother was born. This baby brother has undoubtedly played a much more important role in Adolph's life than has been acknowledged by his biographers. The pertinent fact at the moment, however, is that this brother too died before he was 6 years old. It was Adolph's first real experience with death, and it must have brought up the problem of death again in a much more vivid form. Again, we can surmise he asked himself why they all died while he continued to be saved. The only plausible answer to a child at that age would be that he must be under divine protection. This may seem far-fetched, and yet, as an adult, Hitler tells us that he felt exactly this way when he was at the front during the war, even before he had the vision. Then, too, he speculated on why it is that comrades all around him are killed while he is saved, and again he comes to the conclusion that Providence must be protecting him. Perhaps the exemplary courage he displayed in carrying messages at the front was due to the feeling that some kindly fate was watching over him. Throughout Mein Kampf we find this type of thinking. It was fate that had him born so close to the German border. It was fate that sent him to Vienna to suffer with the masses. It was fate that caused him to do many things. The experience he reports at the front, when a voice told him to pick up his plate and move to another section of the trench just in time to escape a shell which killed all his comrades, must certainly have strengthened this belief to a marked degree and paved the way for his vision later on. The Messiah complex. Another influence may have helped to solidify this system of belief. Among patients, we very frequently find that children who are spoiled at an early age and establish a strong bond with their mother tend to question their paternity. Eldest children in particular are prone to such doubts, and it is most marked in cases where the father is much older than the mother. In Hitler's case, the father was 23 years older, or almost twice the age of the mother. Just why this should be is not clear from a psychological point of view, but in such cases there is a strong tendency to believe that their father is not their real father, and to ascribe their birth to some kind of supernatural conception. Usually such beliefs are dropped as the child grows older. It can be observed in young children, however, and can often be recovered in adults under suitable conditions. Due to the unsympathetic and brutal nature of his father, we may suppose that there was an added incentive in Hitler's case for rejecting him as his real father and postulating some other origin to himself. The problem is not important in itself at the moment, except insofar as it may help to throw some light on the origins of Hitler's conviction in his mission and his belief that he is guided by some extra-natural power which communicates to him what he should or should not do under varying circumstances. This hypothesis is tenable in view of the fact that during his stay in Vienna, when still in his early 20s, he grew a beard, and directly after the war when he again grew a Christ-like beard. Then too, when he was a student at the Benedictine school, his ambition was to join the church and become an abbot or priest. All of these give some indication of a messiah complex long before he had started on his meteoric career and become an open competitor of Christ for the affections of the German people. Fear of death and desire for immortality. Although beliefs of this kind are common during childhood, they are usually dropped or are modified as the individual becomes older and more experienced. In Hitler's case, however, the reverse has taken place. The conviction became stronger as he grew older, until, at the present time, it is the core of his thinking. Under these circumstances, we must suppose that some powerful psychological stream continued to nourish these infantile modes of thought. This psychological stream is probably, as it is in many other cases, a fear of death. It seems logical to suppose that in the course of his early deliberations on the deaths of his brothers, his first conclusion was probably that all the others die, and that consequently he would die too. His fear would not be allayed by his mother's constant concern over his well-being, which he may have interpreted as an indication that the danger was imminent. Such a conclusion would certainly be a valid one for a child to make under the circumstances. The thought of his own death, however, is almost unbearable to a small child. Nothing is quite so demoralizing as the constant dread of self-annihilation. It gnaws away day and night and prevents him from enjoying the good things that life affords. To rid himself of this devastating fear becomes his major objective. This is not easily accomplished, especially when all available evidence seems to corroborate the validity of the fear. In order to offset its potency, he is almost driven to deny its reality by adopting the belief that he is of divine origin and that providence is protecting him from all harm. Only by use of such a technique is the child able to convince himself that he will not die. We must also remember that in Hitler's case, there was not only the unusual succession of deaths of siblings, but there was also the constant menace of his father's brutality, which helps to make the fear more intense than in most children. This danger could easily be exaggerated in Hitler's mind due to a sense of guilt concerning his feelings towards his respective parents and what his father might do to him if he discovered his secret. These feelings would tend to increase his fear of death, at the same time that they caused him to reject his father. Both tendencies would serve to nourish the belief that he was of divine origin and was under its protection. It is my belief that this basic fear of death is still present and active in Hitler's character at the present time. As time goes on and he approaches the age when he might reasonably expect to die, this infantile fear asserts itself more strongly. As a mature, intelligent man, he knows that the law of nature is such that his physical self is destined to die. He is still not able, however, to accept the fact that he is an individual. His psyche will also die. It is this element in his psychological structure which demands that he become immortal. Most people are able to take the sting out of this fear of death through religious beliefs in life after death, or through the feeling that a part of them at least will continue to go on living in their children. In Hitler's case, both of these normal channels have been closed, and he has been forced to seek immortality in a more direct form. He must arrange to go on living in the German people for at least 1,000 years to come. In order to do this, he must oust Christ as a competitor and usurp his place in the lives of the German people. In addition to evidence drawn from experience with patients which would make this hypothesis tenable, we have the evidence afforded by Hitler's own fears and attitudes. We have discussed these in detail in Section 4. Fear of assassination, fear of poisoning, fear of premature death, etc. all deal with the problem of death in an uncamouflaged form. One can, of course, maintain that in view of his position, all these fears are more or less justified. There is certainly some truth to this contention, but we also notice that as time goes on, these fears have increased considerably, until now they have reached the point where the precautions for his own safety far exceed those of any of his predecessors. As long as he could hold a plebiscite every now and then and reassure himself that the German people loved him and wanted him, he felt better. Now that this is no longer possible, he has no easy way of curbing the fear, and his uncertainty in the future becomes greater. There can be little doubt concerning his faith in the results of the plebiscites. He was firmly convinced that 98% of the vote approving his actions really represented the true feelings of the German people. He believed this because he needed such reassurance from time to time in order to carry on with a fairly easy mind and maintain his delusions. When we turn to his fear of cancer, we find no justification whatever for his beliefs, especially in view of the fact that several outstanding specialists in this disease have assured him that it is without foundation. Nevertheless, it is one of his oldest fears, and he continues to adhere to it, in spite of all the expert testimony to the contrary. This fear becomes intelligible when we remember that his mother died following an operation for cancer of the breast. In connection with his fear of death, we must not forget his terrifying nightmares from which he awakes in a cold sweat and acts as though he were being suffocated. If our hypothesis is correct, namely that a fear of death is one of the powerful and unconscious streams which drive Hitler on in his mad career, then we can expect that as the war progresses and he becomes older, the fear will continue to increase. With the progress of events along their present course, it will be more and more difficult for him to feel that his mission is fulfilled and that he has successfully cheated death and achieved immortality in the German people. Nevertheless, we can expect him to keep on trying to the best of his ability, as long as a ray of hope remains. The great danger is that if he feels he cannot achieve immortality as a great redeemer, he may seek it as the great destroyer, who will live on in the minds of the German people for 1,000 years to come. He intimated this in a conversation with Rauschning when he said, quote, "We shall not capitulate, no, never. We may be destroyed, but if we are, we shall drag a world with us, a world in flames," unquote. With him, as with many others of his type, it may well be a case of immortality of any kind at any price. Sexual development. Closely interwoven with several of the themes which have already been elaborated is the development of his sexual life. From what we know about his mother's excessive cleanliness and tidiness, we may assume that she employed rather stringent measures during the toilet training period of her children. This usually results in a residual tension in this area and is regarded by the child as a severe frustration which arouses feelings of hostility. This facilitates an alliance with his infantile aggression, which finds an avenue for expression through anal activities and fantasies. These usually center around soiling, humiliation, and destruction, and form the basis of a sadistic character. Here again, we may assume that the experience was more intense in Hitler's case than in the average due to the strong attachment and spoiling of his mother in early infancy. Unaccustomed to minor frustrations which most children must learn to endure, prior to the toilet training, he was poorly equipped to deal with this experience, which plays an important role in the life of all infants. Even now, as an adult, we find Hitler unable to cope with frustrating experiences on a mature level. That a residual tension from this period still exists in Hitler is evidenced by the frequency of imagery in his speaking and writing, which deal with the dung and dirt and smell. A few illustrations may help to clarify his unconscious preoccupation with these subjects. Quote, "You don't understand. We are just passing a magnet over a dunghill, and we shall see presently how much iron was in the dunghill and has clung to the magnet." By dunghill, Hitler meant the German people. When he, the Jew, turns the treasures over in his hand, they are transformed into dirt and dung. One's hands seize slimy jelly. It slips through one's fingers only to collect again in the next moment. Charity is sometimes actually comparable to the manure which is spread on the field, not out of love for the latter, but out of precaution for one's own benefit later on. Dragged into the dirt and filth of the lowest depths. Later, the smells of these caftan wearers made me ill. Added to this were their dirty clothes and their none too heroic appearance. The rottenness of artificially nurtured conditions of peace has once more stunk to high heaven." Unquote. His libidinal development, however, was not arrested at this point, but progressed to the genital level at which the Oedipus complex, already referred to, developed. This complex, as we have seen, was aggravated by his mother's pregnancy at precisely the age when the complex normally reaches its greatest intensity. In addition to accentuating his hatred for his father and estranging him from his mother, we can assume that this event at this particular time served to generate an abnormal curiosity in him. He, like all children at this age, must have wondered how the unborn child got into the mother's stomach and how it was going to get out. These three reactions have all played an important part in Hitler's psychosexual development. It would seem from the evidence that his aggressive fantasies towards the father reached such a point that he became afraid of the possibility of retaliation if his secret desires were discovered. The retaliation he probably feared was that his father would castrate him or injure his genital capacity in some way, a fear which is later expressed in substitute form in his syphilophobia. Throughout Mein Kampf, he comes back to the topic of syphilis again and again and spends almost an entire chapter describing its horrors. In almost all cases, we find that a fear of this sort is rooted in a fear of genital injury during childhood. In many cases, this fear was so overpowering that the child abandoned his genital sexuality entirely and regressed to earlier stages of libidinal development. In order to maintain these repressions later in life, he uses the horrors of syphilis as a justification for his unconscious fear that genital sexuality is dangerous for him, and also as a rationalization for his avoidance of situations in which his earlier desires might be aroused. In abandoning the genital level of libidinal development, the individual becomes impotent as far as heterosexual relations are concerned. It would appear from the evidence that some such process took place during Hitler's early childhood. Throughout his early adult life, in Vienna, in the army, in Munich, and Landsberg, no informant has reported a heterosexual relationship. In fact, the informants of all these periods make a point of the fact that he has had absolutely no interest in women or any contact with them. Since he has come to power, his peculiar relationship to women has been so noticeable that many writers believe that he is completely asexual. Some have surmised that he suffered a general injury during the last war, others that he is homosexual. The former hypothesis, for which there is not a shred of real evidence, is almost certainly false. The second hypothesis we will examine later on, the diffusion of the sexual instinct. When a regression of this kind takes place, the sexual instinct usually becomes diffuse, and many organs which have yielded some sexual stimulation in the past become permanently invested with sexual significance. The eyes, for example, may become a substitute sexual organ, and seeing then takes on a sexual significance. This seems to have happened in Hitler's case, for a number of informants have commented on his delight in witnessing striptease and nude dancing numbers on the stage. On such occasions, he can never see enough to satisfy him, even though he uses opera glasses in order to observe him more closely. Striptease artists are frequently invited into the Brown House in Munich to perform in private, and there is evidence that he often invites girls to Berchtesgaden for the purpose of exhibiting their bodies. On his walls are numerous pictures of obscene nudes, which conceal nothing, and he takes particular delight in looking through a collection of pornographic pictures which Hoffman has made for him. We also know the extreme pleasure he derives from huge pageants, circus performances, opera, and particularly the movies of which he can never get enough. He has told informants that he gave up flying not only because of the danger involved, but because he could not see enough of the country. For this reason, automobile travel is his favorite form of transportation. From all of this, it is evident that seeing has a special sexual significance for him. This probably accounts for his hypnotic glance, which has been the subject of comment by so many writers. Some have reported that at their first meeting, Hitler fixated them with his eyes as if to bore through them. It is also interesting that when the other person meets his stare, Hitler turns his eyes to the ceiling and keeps them there during the interview. Then, too, we must not forget that in the moment of crisis, his hysterical attack manifested itself in blindness. In addition to the eyes, the anal region has also become highly sexualized, and both feces and buttocks become sexual objects. Due to early toilet training, certain inhibitions have been set up which prevent their direct expression. However, we find so many instances of imagery of this kind, particularly in connection with sexual topics, that we must assume that this area has taken on a sexual significance. The nature of this significance we will consider in a moment. The mouth, too, seems to have become invested as an erogenous zone of great importance. Few authors or informants have neglected to mention Hitler's peculiar dietary habits. He consumes tremendous quantities of sweets, candies, cakes, whipped cream, etc. in the course of a day, in addition to his vegetable diet. On the other hand, he refuses to eat meat, drink beer, or smoke, all of which suggest certain unconscious inhibitions in this area. In addition, he has a pathological fear of poisoning by mouth, and is shown an obsessional preoccupation at times with mouth washing. These suggest a reaction formation or defense against an unacceptable tendency to take something into his mouth or get something out of which, from one point of view, appears to be disgusting. In this connection, we must not forget his resolve to starve himself to death after the failure of the beer hall putsch, his hysterical mutism at the end of the last war, and his love of speaking. The significance of these we shall consider later on. Disturbance of love relations. The second effect of his mother's pregnancy was his estrangement from her. The direct result of this was, on the one hand, an idealization of love, but without a sexual component, and on the other hand, the setting up of a barrier against intimate relationships with other people, particularly women. Having been hurt once, he unconsciously guards himself against a similar hurt in the future. In his relationship to his niece Gelly, he tried to overcome this barrier, but he was again disappointed, and since then has not exposed himself to a really intimate relationship, either with a man or a woman. He has cut himself off from the world in which love plays any part, for fear of being hurt, and what love he can experience is fixated on the abstract entity, Germany, which, as we have seen, is a symbol of his ideal mother. This is a love relationship in which sex plays no part. Origins of his perversion. The third outcome of his mother's pregnancy was to arouse an excessive curiosity. The great mystery to children of this age who find themselves in this situation is how the unborn child got into the mother's stomach and how it is going to get out. Even in cases where the children have witnessed parental intercourse, this event is rarely linked with the ensuing pregnancy. Since in their limited experience, everything that gets into their stomach enters by way of the mouth, and everything that comes out usually does so by way of the rectum, they are prone to believe that conception somehow takes place through the mouth, and that the child will be born via the anus. Hitler, as a child, undoubtedly adhered to this belief, but this did not satisfy his curiosity. He evidently wanted to see for himself how it came out and exactly what happened. This curiosity laid the foundation for his strange perversion, which brought all three of his sexualized zones into play. In her description of sexual experiences with Hitler, Gelly stressed the fact that it was of utmost importance to him that she squat over him in such a way that he could see everything. It is interesting that Rome, in an entirely different connection, once said, quote, "He, Hitler, is thinking about the peasant girls. When they stand in the fields and bend down at their work so that you can see their behinds, that's what he likes, especially when they've got big round ones. That's Hitler's sex life. What a man," unquote. Hitler, who was present, did not stir a muscle but only stared at Rome with compressed lips. From a consideration of all the evidence, it would seem that Hitler's perversion is as Gelly has described it. The great danger in gratifying it, however, is that the individual might get feces or urine into his mouth. It is this danger that requires that suitable inhibitions be instituted. Return to the womb. Another possibility in infantile thinking presents itself in this connection. When the home environment is harsh and brutal, as it was in Hitler's case, the small child very frequently envies the position of passivity and security the unborn child enjoys within the mother. This in turn gives rise to fantasies of finding a way into the longed-for claustrum and ousting his rival in order that he may take his place. These fantasies are usually of very brief duration because, as the child believes, if he succeeded he would have nothing to eat or drink except feces and urine. The thought of such a diet arouses feelings of disgust, and consequently he abandons his fantasies in order to avoid these unpleasant feelings. In many psychotics, however, these fantasies continue. In Hitler's case, and strive to express themselves overtly. The outstanding bit of evidence in Hitler's case that such fantasies were present is to be found in the Kelchstein, or eagle's nest, which he has built for himself near Berchtesgaden. Interestingly enough, many people have commented that only a madman would conceive of such a place, let alone try to build it. From a symbolic point of view, one can easily imagine that this is a materialization of a child's conception of the return to the womb. First, there is a long, hard road, then a heavily guarded entrance, a trip through a long tunnel to an extremely inaccessible place. There one can be alone, safe and undisturbed, and revel in the joys that Mother Nature bestows. It is also interesting to note that very few people have ever been invited there, and many of Hitler's closest associates are either unaware of its existence or have only seen it from a distance. Extraordinarily enough, Francois Poncet is one of the few people who was ever invited to visit there. In the French Yellow Book, he gives us an extremely vivid description of the place, a part of which may be worthwhile in quoting. Quote, "The approach is by a winding road about 9 miles long, boldly cut out of the rock. The road comes to an end in front of a long underground passage leading into the mountain, enclosed by a heavy double door of bronze. At the far end of the underground passage, a wide lift, paneled with sheets of copper, awaits the visitor. Through a vertical shaft of 330 feet cut right through the rock, it rises up to the level of the Chancellor's dwelling place. Here is reached the astonishing climax. The visitor finds himself in a strong and massive building containing a gallery with Roman pillars, an immense circular hall with windows all around. It gives the impression of being suspended in space. An almost overhanging wall of bare rock rises up abruptly. The whole, bathed in the twilight of the autumn evening, is grandiose, wild, almost hallucinating. The visitor wonders whether he is awake or dreaming." Unquote. If one were asked to plan something which represented a return to the womb, one could not possibly surpass the Kelstein. It is also significant that Hitler often retires to this strange place to await instructions concerning the course he is to pursue. Vegetarianism. We can surmise from the psychological defenses Hitler has set up that there was a period during which he struggled against these tendencies. In terms of unconscious symbolism, meat is almost synonymous with feces and beer with urine. The fact that there is a strict taboo on both would indicate that these desires are still present, and that it is only by refraining from everything symbolizing them that he can avoid arousing anxieties. Rauschning reports that Hitler, following Wagner, attributed much of the decay of our civilization to meat eating, that the decadence had its origin in the abdomen, chronic constipation, poisoning of the juices, and the results of drinking to excess. This assertion suggests decay, contamination, corruption, pollution, and death as the resultant of constipation, that is, feces in the gastrointestinal tract. And if this is so, decay might be avoided, both by not eating anything resembling feces and by taking purges or ejecting as frequently as possible. It has been reported that Hitler once said that he was confident that all nations would arrive at the point where they would not feed anyone on dead animals. It is interesting to note that according to one of our most reliable informants, Hitler only became a real vegetarian after the death of his niece Gellie. In clinical practice, one almost invariably finds compulsive vegetarianism setting in after the death of a loved object. We may therefore regard Hitler's perversion as a compromise between psychotic tendencies to eat feces and drink urine on the one hand, and to live a normal, socially adjusted life on the other. The compromise is not, however, satisfactory to either side of his nature, and the struggle between these two diverse tendencies continues to rage unconsciously. We must not suppose that Hitler gratifies his strange perversion frequently. Patients of this type rarely do, and in Hitler's case, it is highly probable that he has permitted himself to go this far only with his niece Gellie, and possibly with Henny Hoffmann. The practice of this perversion represents an extreme form of masochistic degradation. Masochistic gratifications. In most patients suffering from this perversion, the unconscious forces only get out of control to this degree when a fairly strong love relationship is established and sexuality makes decisive demands. In other relationships where the love component is less strong, the individual contents himself with less degrading activities. This is brought out clearly in the case of Renée Muller, who confided to her director, Zeisler, who had asked her what was troubling her after spending an evening at the Chancellery, said that the evening before she had been with Hitler and that she had been sure that he was going to have intercourse with her, that they had both undressed and were apparently getting ready for bed when Hitler fell on the floor and begged her to kick him. She demurred, but he pleaded with her and condemned himself as unworthy, heaped all kinds of accusations on his own head, and just groveled around in an agonizing manner. The scene became intolerable to her, and she finally acceded to his wishes and kicked him. This excited him greatly, and he begged for more and more, always saying that it was even better than he deserved, and that he was not worthy to be in the same room with her. As she continued to kick him, he became more and more excited. Renee Muller committed suicide shortly after this experience. At this place, it might be well to note that Eva Braun, his present female companion, has twice attempted suicide. Gelly was either murdered or committed suicide, and Unity Mitford has attempted suicide. Rather an unusual record for a man who has had so few affairs with women. Hafstengel, Strasser, and Rauschning, as well as several other informants, have reported that even in company when Hitler is smitten with a girl, he tends to grovel at her feet in a most disgusting manner. Here, too, he insists on telling the girl that he is unworthy to kiss her hand or sit near her, and that he hopes she will be kind to him, etc. From all of this we see the constant struggle against complete degradation whenever any affectionate components enter into the picture. It now becomes clear that the only way in which Hitler can control these coprophagic tendencies, or their milder manifestations, is to isolate himself from any intimate relationships in which warm feelings of affection or love might assert themselves. As soon as such feelings are aroused, he feels compelled to degrade himself in the eyes of the loved object and eat their dirt figuratively, if not literally. These tendencies disgust him just as much as they disgust us, but under these circumstances they get out of control and he despises himself and condemns himself for his weakness. Before considering further the effects of this struggle on his manifest behavior, we must pause for a moment to pick up another thread. Femininity. We notice that in all of these activities Hitler plays the passive role. His behavior is masochistic in the extreme, inasmuch as he derives sexual pleasure from punishment inflicted on his own body. There is every reason to suppose that during his early years, instead of identifying himself with his father, as most boys do, he identified himself with his mother. This was perhaps easier for him than for most boys, since, as we have seen, there is a large feminine component to his physical makeup. His mother, too, must have been an extremely masochistic individual, or she never would have entered into this marriage, nor would she have endured the brutal treatment from her husband. An emotional identification with his mother would, therefore, carry him in the direction of a passive, sentimental, evasive, and submissive form of adjustment. Many writers and informants have commented on his feminine characteristics, his gait, his hands, his mannerisms, and his ways of thinking. Hafstengel reports that when he showed Dr. Jung a specimen of Hitler's handwriting, the latter immediately exclaimed that it was a typically feminine hand. His choice of art as a profession might also be interpreted as a manifestation of a basic feminine identification. There are definite indications of such an emotional adjustment later in life. The outstanding of these is perhaps his own behavior towards his officers during the last war. His comrades report that during the 4 years he was in service, he was not only over-submissive to all his officers, but frequently volunteered to do their washing and take care of their clothes. This would certainly indicate a strong tendency to assume the feminine role in the presence of a masculine figure whenever this was feasible and could be duly rationalized. His extreme sentimentality, his emotionality, his occasional softness, and his weeping, even after he became chancellor, may be regarded as manifestations of a fundamental feminine pattern, which undoubtedly had its origin in his relationship to his mother. His persistent fear of cancer, which was the illness from which his mother died, may also be considered as an expression of his early identification with her. Although we cannot enter into a discussion concerning the frequency of this phenomenon in Germany, it may be well to note that there is sociological evidence which would indicate that it is probably extremely common. If further research on the subject should corroborate this evidence, it might prove of extreme value to our psychological warfare program, insofar as it would give us a key to the understanding of the basic nature of the German male character and the role that the Nazi organization plays in their inner life. Homosexuality. The great difficulty is that this form of identification early in life carries the individual in the direction of passive homosexuality. Hitler has for years been suspected of being a homosexual, although there is no reliable evidence that he is actually engaged in a relationship of this kind. Rauschning reports that he has met 2 boys who claimed that they were Hitler's homosexual partners, but their testimony can scarcely be taken at its face value. More condemning would be the remarks dropped by Forster, the Danzig Gauleiter, in conversations with Rauschning. Even here, however, the remarks deal only with Hitler's impotence as far as heterosexual relations go, without actually implying that he indulges in homosexuality. It is probably true that Hitler calls Forster "Booby," which is a common nickname employed by homosexuals in addressing their partners. This alone, however, is not adequate proof that he has actually indulged in homosexual practices with Forster, who is known to be a homosexual. The belief that Hitler is homosexual has probably developed A, from the fact that he does show so many feminine characteristics, and B, from the fact that there were so many homosexuals in the party during the early days, and many continue to occupy important positions. It does seem that Hitler feels much more at ease with homosexuals than with normal persons, but this may be due to the fact that they are all fundamentally social outcasts, and consequently have a community of interests which tends to make them think and feel more or less alike. In this connection, it is interesting to note that homosexuals, too, frequently regard themselves as a special form of creation, or as chosen ones whose destiny it is to initiate a new order. The fact that underneath they feel themselves to be different and ostracized from normal social contacts usually makes them easy converts to a new social philosophy which does not discriminate against them. Being among civilization's discontents, they are always willing to take a chance of something new which holds any promise of improving their lot, even though their chances of success may be small and the risk great. Having little to lose to begin with, they can afford to take chances which others would refrain from taking. The early Nazi Party certainly contained many members who could be regarded in this light. Even today, Hitler derives sexual pleasure from looking at men's bodies and associating with homosexuals. Strasser tells us that his personal bodyguard is almost always 100% homosexuals. He also derives considerable pleasure from being with his Hitler Youth, and his attitude towards them frequently tends to be more that of a woman than that of a man. There is a possibility that Hitler has participated in homosexual relationship at some time in his life. The evidence is such that we can only say there is a strong tendency in this direction, which, in addition to the manifestations already enumerated, often finds expression in imagery concerning being attacked from behind or being stabbed in the back. His nightmares, which frequently deal with being attacked by a man and being suffocated, also suggest strong homosexual tendencies and a fear of them. From these indications, however, we would conclude that for the most part, these tendencies have been repressed, which would speak against the probability of their being expressed in overt form. On the other hand, persons suffering from his perversion sometimes do indulge in homosexual practices in the hope that they might find sexual gratification. Even this perversion would be more acceptable to them than the one with which they are afflicted. Early school years. The foundations of all the diverse patterns we have been considering were laid during the first years of Hitler's life. Many of them, as we have seen, were due primarily to the peculiar structure of the home, while others developed from constitutional factors or false interpretations of events. Whatever their origins may have been, they did set up antisocial tendencies and tensions which disturbed the child to a high degree. From his earliest days, it would seem he must have felt that the world was a pretty bad place in which to live. To him it must have seemed as though the world was filled with insurmountable hazards and obstacles which prevented him from obtaining adequate gratifications, and dangers which would menace his well-being if he attempted to obtain them in a direct manner. The result was that an unusual amount of bitterness against the world and the people in it became generated, for which he could find no suitable outlets. As a young child, he must have been filled with intense feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and guilt, which made him anything but a happy child. It would seem, however, that he managed to repress most of his troublesome tendencies and make a temporary adjustment to a difficult environment before he was 6 years old, because at that time he entered school, and for the next years he was an unusually good student. All of the report cards that have been found from the time he entered school until he was 11 years old show an almost unbroken line of A's in all his school subjects. From the age of 11, the bottom dropped right out of his academic career. From an A student, he suddenly dropped to a point where he failed in almost all his subjects and had to repeat the year. This amazing about-face only becomes intelligible when we realize that his baby brother died at that time. We can only surmise that this event served to reawaken his earlier conflicts and disrupt his psychological equilibrium. In Hitler's case, we may suppose that this event affected him in at least two important ways. First, it must have reawakened fears of his own death, which, in turn, strengthened still further the conviction that he was the chosen one and under divine protection. Second, it would seem that he connected the death of his brother with his own thinking and wishing on the subject. Unquestionably, he hated this intruder and frequently thought of how nice it would be if he were removed from the scene. Unconsciously, if not consciously, he must have felt that the brother's death was the result of his own thinking on the subject. This accentuated his feelings of guilt on the one hand, while it strengthened still further his belief in special powers of divine origin on the other. To think about these things was almost synonymous with having them come true. In order to avoid further guilt feelings, he had to put a curb on his thinking process. Ease. The result of this inhibition on thinking was that Hitler the good student was transformed into Hitler the poor student. Not only did he have to repeat the school year during which the brother died, but ever after his academic performance was mediocre, to say the least. When we examine his later report cards, we find that he does well only in such subjects as drawing and gymnastics, which require no thinking. In all the other subjects, such as mathematics, languages, or history, which require some thinking, his work is on the borderline, sometimes satisfactory, sometimes unsatisfactory. We can easily imagine that it was during this period that the father's ire was aroused, and he began to bring pressure on the boy to apply himself in his schoolwork and threaten dire consequences if he failed to do so. From sociological evidence, it would seem that this is about the age at which most German fathers first take a real interest in their sons and their education. If Hitler's father followed this general pattern, we can assume that he had cause to be irate at his son's performance. The constant struggle between himself and his father, which he describes in Mein Kampf, is probably true, although the motivations underlying his actions were in all likelihood quite different from those he describes. He was approaching the adolescent period, and this, together with his little brother's death, served to bring many dormant attitudes nearer to the surface of consciousness. Many of these attitudes now found expression in the father-son relationship. Briefly enumerated, these would be A. Rejection of the father as a model. B. An inhibition against following a career which demanded thinking. C. The anal tendencies which found an outlet of expression in smearing. D. His passive feminine tendencies. And E. His masochistic tendencies and his desire to be dominated by a strong masculine figure. He was not, however, ready for an open revolt, for he tells us in his autobiography that he believed passive resistance and obstinacy were the best course, and that if he followed them long enough, his father would eventually relent and allow him to leave school and follow an artist's career. As a matter of fact, his brother Alois, in 1930, before the Hitler myth was well established, reported that his father never had any objections to Adolph's becoming an artist, but that he did demand that Adolph do well in school. From this we might surmise that the friction between father and son was not determined so much by his choice of a career as by unconscious tendencies which were deriving satisfaction from the antagonism. He carried the same pattern into the schools where he was forever antagonizing his teachers and the other boys. He has tried to create the impression that he was a leader among his classmates, which is almost certainly false. More reliable evidence indicates that he was unpopular among his classmates, as well as among his teachers, who considered him lazy, uncooperative, and a troublemaker. The only teacher during these years with whom he was able to get along was Ludwig Poch, an ardent German nationalist. It would be an error, however, to suppose that Poch inculcated these nationalist feelings in Hitler. It is much more logical to assume that all these feelings were present in Hitler before he came in contact with Poch, and that his nationalist teachings only offered Hitler a new outlet for the expression of his repressed emotions. It was probably during this period that he discovered a resemblance between the young state of Germany and his mother, and between the old Austrian monarchy and his father. At this discovery, he promptly joined the nationalist group of students who were defying authority of the Austrian state. In this way, he was able to proclaim openly his love for his mother and advocate the death of his father. These were feelings he had for a long time, but it was unable to express. Now he was able to obtain partial gratification through the use of symbols. The death of his father. This probably served to increase the friction between father and son, for in spite of what Hitler says, the best evidence seems to indicate that the father was anti-German in his sentiments. This again placed father and son on opposite sides of the fence and gave them new cause for hostility. There is no telling how this would have worked out in the long run, because while the struggle between the two was at its height, the father fell dead on the street. The repercussions of this event must have been severe and reinforced all those feelings which we have described in connection with the brother's death. Again, it must have seemed like a fulfillment of a wish, and again, there must have been severe feelings of guilt with an additional inhibition on thinking processes. His school work continued to decline, and it seems that in order to avoid a complete failure, he was taken from the school at Linz and sent to school in Stier. He managed to complete the year, however, with marks which were barely satisfactory. It was while he was there that the doctor told him that he had a disease from which he would never recover. His reaction to this was severe, since it brought the possibility of his own death very much into the foreground and aggravated all his childhood fears. The result was that he did not return to school and finish his course, but stayed at home, where he lived a life which was marked by passivity. He neither studied nor worked, but spent most of his time in bed, where he was again spoiled by his mother, who catered to his every need despite her poor financial circumstances. One could suppose that this was the materialization of his conception of paradise, inasmuch as it reinstated an earlier childhood situation which he had always longed for. It would seem from his own account, however, that things did not go too smoothly, for he writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "When at the age of 14 the young man is dismissed from school, it is difficult to say which is worse, his unbelievable ignorance as far as knowledge and ability are concerned, or the biting impudence of his behavior combined with an immorality which makes one's hair stand on end. The 3-year-old child has now become a youth of 15 who despises all authority. Now he loiters about, and God only knows when he comes home." Unquote. We can imagine the deaths of his brother and his father in rapid succession had filled him with such guilt that he could not enjoy this idyllic situation to the full. Perhaps the situation aroused desires in him which he could no longer face on a conscious level, and he could only keep these in check by either remaining in bed and playing the part of a helpless child, or absenting himself from the situation entirely. In any case, he must have been a considerable problem to his mother, who died 4 years after his father. Dr. Bloch informs us that her great concern in dying was, what would become of poor Adolph? He is still so young. At this time Adolph was 18 years of age. He had failed at school and had not gone to work. He describes himself at this time as a milksop, which he undoubtedly was. Admission examinations to Academy of Art. 2 months before his mother's death, he had gone to Vienna to take the entrance examinations for admissions to the Academy of Art. At this time he knew that his mother was in a critical condition, and that it was only a matter of a few months before death would overtake her. He knew, therefore, that his easy existence at home would shortly come to an end, and that he would have to face the cold, hard world on his own. It is sometimes extraordinary how events in the lifetime of an individual fall together. The first day's assignment on the examination was to draw a picture depicting, quote, the expulsion from paradise, unquote. It must have seemed to him that fate had chosen this topic to fit his personal situation. On the second day he must have felt that fate was rubbing it in when he found the assignment to be a picture depicting, quote, an episode of the Great Flood, unquote. These particular topics in his situation must have aroused such intense emotional reactions within him that he could hardly be expected to do his best. Art critics seem to feel that he has some artistic talent, even though it is not outstanding. The comment of the examiners was, too few heads. We can understand in this view of the circumstances under which he had taken the examination. Death of his mother. He returned home shortly after the examinations. He helped to look after his mother, who was rapidly failing and in extreme pain. She died on December 21st, 1907, and was buried on Christmas Eve. Adolph was completely broken and stood for a long time at her grave, after the remainder of the family had left. Dr. Bloch says, quote, "In all my career I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler," unquote. His world had come to an end. Not long after the funeral he left for Vienna in order to follow his father's footsteps and make his own way in the world. He made a poor job of it, however. He could not hold a job when he had one, and sunk lower and lower in the social scale until he was compelled to live with the dregs of society. As he writes about these experiences in Mein Kampf, one gets the impression that it was a terrific struggle against overwhelming odds. From what we know now of Adolf Hitler, it would seem more likely that this existence yielded him considerable gratification in spite of its hardships. It is perfectly clear from what Hanisch writes that with a very small amount of effort he could have made a fair living and improved his condition by painting watercolors. He refused to make this effort and preferred to live in the filth and poverty which surrounded him. There must have been something in this that he liked, consciously or unconsciously. When we examine Hanisch's book carefully, we find the answer. Hitler's life in Vienna was one of extreme passivity, in which activity was held at the lowest level consistent with survival. He seemed to enjoy being dirty and even filthy in his appearance and personal cleanliness. This can mean only one thing from a psychological point of view, namely, that his perversion was in the process of maturation and was finding gratification in a more or less symbolic form. His attitude during this period could be summarized in the following terms: I enjoy nothing more than to lie around while the world defecates on me. And he probably delighted in being covered with dirt, which was tangible proof of the fact. Even in these days, he lived in a flophouse which was known to be inhabited by men who lent themselves to homosexual practices, and it was probably for this reason that he was listed on the Vienna police record as a sexual pervert. Nobody has ever offered an explanation of why he remained in Vienna for over 5 years if his life there was as distasteful and the city disgusted him to the degree that he claims in his autobiography. He was free to leave whenever he wished and could have gone to his beloved Germany years earlier if he had so desired. The fact of the matter is that he probably derived great masochistic satisfaction from his miserable life in Vienna, and it was not until his perversion became full-blown and he realized its implications that he fled to Munich at the beginning of 1913. Anti-Semitism. With the development of his perverse tendencies, we also find the development of his anti-Semitism. There is absolutely no evidence that he had any anti-Semitic feelings before he left Linz, or that he had any during the first years of his stay in Vienna. On the contrary, he was on the very best terms with Dr. Bloch while he was in Linz, and sent him postcards with very warm sentiments for some time after he went to Vienna. Furthermore, his closest friends in Vienna were Jews, some of whom were extremely kind to him. Then, too, we must remember that his godfather, who lived in Vienna, was a Jew, and it is possible that during his first year there he might have lived with his family. Most of the records of his mother's death are incorrect and place the event exactly 1 year after it had happened. During this year, Hitler lived in Vienna, but we have no clue as to what he did or how he managed to live without money during this intervening year. All we know is that he had had time for painting during this period, for he submitted the work he had done to the Academy of Art the following October. He was not admitted to the examination, however, because the examiners found the work of this period unsatisfactory. Shortly afterwards, he applied for admission to the School of Architecture, but was rejected. The cause of his rejection was probably inadequate talent rather than the fact that he had not completed his course in the Realschule. It is only after this happened that we find him going to work as a laborer on a construction job, and from then on we have a fairly complete picture of his activities. We know now that he had very little money when he left Linz, certainly not enough to live on for almost an entire year while he spent time in painting. Since the date of his mother's death has been so universally distorted, it would seem that efforts were being made to cover something which happened during this intervening year. My guess would be that he lived with his Jewish godparents, who supported him while he was preparing work for the academy. When he failed to be admitted at the end of the year, they put him out and made him go to work. There is one bit of evidence for this hypothesis. Hanisch, in his book, mentions in passing that when they were particularly destitute, he went with Hitler to visit a well-to-do Jew whom Hitler said was his father. The wealthy Jew would have nothing to do with him and sent him on his way again. There is scarcely a possibility that Hitler's father was a Jew living in Vienna at this time, but Hanisch might easily have understood him to say father when he said godfather. This would certainly make much more sense and would indicate that Hitler had contact with his godparents before the visit and that they were fed up with him and would help him no further. Projection. Hitler's outstanding defense mechanism is one commonly called projection. It is a technique by which the ego of an individual defends itself against unpleasant impulses, tendencies, or characteristics by denying their existence in himself while he attributes them to others. Innumerable examples of this mechanism could be cited in Hitler's case, but a few will suffice for purposes of illustration. Quote, "In the last 6 years I had to stand intolerable things from states like Poland. It must be possible that the German nation can live its life without being constantly molested. Social democracy directs a bombardment of lies and calumnies towards the adversary who seemed most dangerous, till finally the nerves of those who have been attacked give out, and they, for the sake of peace, bow down to the hated enemy. For this peace proposal of mine I was abused and personally insulted. Mr. Chamberlain, in fact, spat upon me before the eyes of the world. It was in keeping with our own harmlessness that England took the liberty of some day meeting our peaceful activity with the brutality of the violent egoist. The outstanding features of Polish character were cruelty and lack of moral restraint." Unquote. from a psychological point of view, it is not too far-fetched to suppose that as the perversion developed and became more disgusting to Hitler's ego, its demands were more disowned and projected upon the Jew. By this process, the Jew became a symbol of everything which Hitler hated in himself. Again, his own personal problems and conflicts were transferred from within himself to the external world, where they assumed the proportions of racial and national conflicts. Forgetting entirely that for years he had not only looked like a lower-class Jew, but was as dirty as the dirtiest and as great a social outcast, he now began to see the Jew as the source of all evil. The teachings of Schoner and Lueger helped to solidify and rationalize his feelings and inner convictions. More and more he became convinced that the Jew was a great parasite on humanity, which sucked its lifeblood, and if a nation was to become great, it must rid itself of this pestilence. Translated back into personal terms, this would read, quote, "My perversion is a parasite which sucks my lifeblood, and if I am to become great, I must rid myself of this pestilence," unquote. When we see the connection between his sexual perversion and anti-Semitism, we can understand another aspect of his constant linking of syphilis with the Jew. These are the things which destroy nations and civilizations as a perversion destroys an individual. The greater the demands of his perversion became, the more he hated the Jews and the more he talked against them. Everything which was bad was attributed to them. Here was his political career in an embryo state. He now spent most of his time reading books, attending political talks, and reading newspapers in cafe houses. He himself tells us in so many words that he skipped through this material and only took out those parts which were useful to him. In other words, he was not reading and listening in order to become educated sufficiently to form a rational judgment of the problem. This would have been a violation of his earlier inhibition on thinking. He read only in order to find additional justification for his own inner feelings and convictions and to rationalize his projections. He has continued this technique up to the present time. He does a great deal of reading on many diverse subjects, but he never forms a rational opinion in the light of the information, but only pays attention to those parts which convince him that he was right to begin with. In the evening he would return to his flop house and harangue his associates with political and anti-Semitic speeches until he became a joke. This, however, did not disturb him too much. On the contrary, it seemed to act as a stimulant for further reading and the gathering of more arguments to prove his point of view. It was as though in trying to convince others of the dangers of Jewish domination, he was really trying to convince himself of the dangers of being dominated by his perversion. Perhaps Hitler is really referring to his perversion when he writes, quote, "During the long pre-war years of peace, certain pathological features had certainly appeared. There were many signs of decay which ought to have stimulated serious reflection," unquote. The same may also be true when he says, quote, "How could the German people's political instincts become so morbid? The question involved here was not that of a single symptom, but instances of decay which flared up now in legion, which like poisonous ulcers ate into the nation, now here, now there. It seemed as though a continuous flow of poison was driven into the farthest blood vessels of this one-time heroic body by a mysterious power, so as to lead to ever more severe paralysis of sound reason and of the simple instinct of self-preservation," unquote. As time went on, the sexual stimulation of the Viennese environment seemed to aggravate the demands of his perversion. He suddenly became overwhelmed by the role that sex plays in the life of the lower classes and the Jews. Vienna became for him the symbol of incest, and he suddenly left it to seek refuge with his ideal mother, Germany. But his pre-war days in Munich were not different from those he left behind in Vienna. His life was still one of extreme passivity, and although we know little about them, we can surmise that his days were filled with inner troubles. The First World War. Under these circumstances, we can understand why he thanked God for the First World War. For him, it represented an opportunity of giving up his individual war against himself in exchange for a national war in which he would have to help the help of others. It also represented to him, on an unconscious level, an opportunity of redeeming his mother and assuming a masculine role for himself. Even at that time, we may suppose he had inklings that he was destined to be a great redeemer. It was not only his mother who was going to be redeemed, but also himself. His advent in the German army was really his first step in attempting to redeem himself as a social human being. No longer was he to be the underdog, for he was joining forces with those who were determined to conquer and become great. Activity replaced his earlier passivity to a large degree. Dirt, filth, and poverty were left behind, and he could mingle with the chosen people on an equal footing. But for him this was not enough. As we have pointed out in an earlier section, he was not content to be as clean as the average soldier. He had to go to the other extreme and become exceedingly clean. Whenever he returned from the front, he immediately sat down and scrupulously removed every speck of mud from his person, much to the amusement of his comrades. Mend, his comrade during this time, relates an experience at the front, when Hitler upbraided one of the other men for not keeping himself clean and called him a manure pile, which sounds very much like a memory of himself in Vienna. During this period, as previously mentioned, his passive feminine tendencies were finding an outlet in his abusive conduct toward his officers. It looks as though he had not progressed sufficiently far in his conquest of himself to maintain a wholly masculine role, but with the help of others and the guidance of his respected officers, he was making some progress toward what appeared to be a social adjustment. The final defeat of Germany, however, upset his well-laid plans and shattered his hopes and ambitions. The defeat of Germany. Nevertheless, it was this event which proved to be the turning point in his life and determined that he would be an outstanding success rather than a total failure. Unconscious forces, some of which had been dormant for years, were now reawakened and upset his whole psychological equilibrium. His reaction to this event was a hysterical attack, which manifested itself in blindness and mutism. Although the hysterical blindness saved him from witnessing what he regarded as an intolerable spectacle, it did not save him from the violent emotional reactions it aroused. These emotions, we may assume, were similar to those in which he had experienced as a child when he discovered his parents in intercourse. It seems logical to suppose that at the time he felt that his mother was being defiled before his eyes, but in view of his father's power and brutality, he felt himself utterly helpless to redeem her honor or to save her from future assaults. If this is true, we would expect that he swore secret vengeance against his father, and as has been shown, there is evidence to this effect. Now the same thing was happening again, but instead of his real mother, it was his ideal mother, Germany, who was being betrayed, corrupted, and humiliated. And again he was unable to come to her rescue. A deep depression set in, of which he writes, quote, "What now followed were terrible days and even worse nights. Now I knew that everything was lost. In those nights my hatred arose, the hatred against the originators of this deed," unquote. But again he was weak and helpless, a blind cripple lying in a hospital. He struggled with the problem, quote, "How shall our nation be freed from the chains of this poisonous embrace?" unquote. It would seem that the more he thought about it, the more his intellect told him that all was lost. He probably despised and condemned himself for his weakness, and as his hatred continued to rise in the face of this frustrating experience, he vowed then and there to, quote, "know neither rest nor peace until the November criminals had been overthrown," unquote. Undoubtedly, his emotions were extremely violent, and would serve as a powerful motive for much of the retaliation which becomes so prominent in his later behavior. There are, however, many ways of retaliating which do not involve a complete upheaval and transformation of character, such as we find in Hitler at this time. From our experience with patients, we know that complete transformations of this kind usually take place only under circumstances of extreme duress, which demonstrate to the individual that his present character structure is no longer tenable. Naturally, we do not know exactly what went on in Hitler's mind during this period, or how he regarded his own position. We do know, however, that under such circumstances very strange thoughts and fantasies pass through the minds of relatively normal people, and that in the case of neurotics, particularly when they have strong masochistic tendencies, these fantasies can become extremely absurd. Whatever the nature of these fantasies might have been, we may be reasonably sure that they involved his own safety or well-being. Only a danger of this magnitude would ordinarily cause an individual to abandon or revolutionize his character structure. It may be that his nightmares will yield a clue. These, it may be remembered, center on the theme of his being attacked or subjected to indignities by another man. It is not his mother who is being attacked, but himself. When he wakes from these nightmares, he acts as though he were choking. He gasps for breath and breaks out in a cold sweat. It is only with great difficulty that he can be quieted, because frequently there is an hallucinatory after effect, and he believes he sees the man in his bedroom. Under ordinary circumstances, we would be inclined to interpret this as the result of an unconscious wish for homosexual relations, together with an ego revulsion against the latent tendency. This interpretation might apply to Hitler too, for to some extent it seems as though he reacted to the defeat of Germany as a rape of himself, as well as of his symbolic mother. Furthermore, while he was lying helpless in the hospital, unable to see or speak, He could well have considered himself an easy object for a homosexual attack. When we remember, however, that for years he chose to live in a Vienna flophouse, which was known to be inhabited by many homosexuals, and later on associated with several notorious homosexuals, such as Hess and Rome, we cannot feel that this form of attack alone would be sufficient to threaten his integrity to such an extent that he would repudiate his former self. A further clue to his thoughts during this period may be found in his great preoccupation with propaganda, which, in his imagery, is almost synonymous with poison. Quote, slogan after slogan rained down on our people. The front was flooded with this poison, for the effect of its language on me was like that of spiritual vitriol. I sometimes had to fight down the rage rising in me because of this concentrated solution of lies, unquote. This type of imagery probably has a double significance. There is considerable evidence to show that as a child, he believed that the man, during intercourse, injected poison into the woman, which gradually destroyed her from within and finally brought about her death. This is not an uncommon belief in childhood, and in view of the fact that his mother died from a cancer of the breast after a long illness, the belief may have been more vivid and persisted longer in Hitler than in most children. On the other hand, the importance of poison in connection with his perversion has already been considered. We know now about his inhibitions against taking certain substances into his mouth. These were not present during the early days of his career, but developed much later in connection with his transformed character. In view of all this, it may not be too far-fetched to suppose that while he was fantasizing about what the victors might do to the vanquished when they arrived, his masochistic and perverse tendencies conjured up the thought that they might attack him and force him to eat dung and drink urine, a practice which, it is alleged, is fairly common in Nazi concentration camps. Interestingly enough, this idea is incorporated into the colloquial expression, to eat the dirt of the victors, and in his weakened and helpless condition he would be unable to ward off such an attack. Such an hypothesis gains credence when we review the behavior of Nazi troops in the role of conquerors. Transformation of character. Although a thought of this kind would have certain pleasurable aspects to a masochistic person, it would also arouse fear of consequences together with violent feelings of guilt and disgust. If the thought kept recurring at frequent intervals and refused to be suppressed, we can easily imagine that it might drive an individual into such depths of despair that death would appear as the only solution. Hitler's fear of death has already been reviewed, and it is possible that it was this alternative which shocked him out of his former self. Certain that it is, in his public utterances as well in his actions, he attributes extraordinary powers to the fear of death. Quote, I shall spread terror by the surprise employment of my measures. The important thing is the sudden shock of an overwhelming fear of death. Unquote. And in Mein Kampf, he tells us that, quote, in the end, only the urge for self-preservation will eternally succeed. Under its pressure of so-called humanity, as the expression of a mixture of stupidity, cowardice, and imaginary superior intelligence, will melt like snow under the March sun. Unquote. Sentiments of this sort suggest rather strongly that he was brought face to face with the prospect of his own death, and that in order to save himself, he had to rid himself of a bad conscience as well as the dictates of the intellect. The following quotations illustrate his attitude towards conscience and of the need of rendering it inactive. Quote, only when the time comes when the race is no longer overshadowed by the consciousness of its own guilt, then it will find internal peace and external energy to cut down regardlessly and brutally the wild shoots and to pull up the weeds. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish like circumcision. I am freeing men from the restraints of an intelligence that has taken charge, from the dirty and degrading modifications of a chimera called conscience and morality. Unquote. And of the intellect, he says, quote, the intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life. We must distrust the intelligence and the conscience, and must place our faith in our instincts. Unquote. Having repudiated these two important human functions, he was left almost entirely at the mercy of his passions, instincts, and unconscious desires. At the crucial moment, these forces surged to the fore in the form of an hallucination in which an inner voice informed him that he was destined to redeem the German people and lead them to greatness. This for him was a new view of life. It opened new vistas to him, particularly in connection with himself. Not only did it confirm the vague feeling he had since childhood, namely, that he was the chosen one and under the protection of Providence, but also that he had been saved for a divine mission. This revelation served to crystallize his personality on a new pattern. He writes, quote, "In the hours of distress, when others despair, out of apparently harmless children, there shoots suddenly heroes of death-defying determination and icy coolness of reflection. If this hour of trial had never come, then hardly anyone would ever have been able to guess that a young hero is hidden in the beardless boy. Nearly always such an impetus is needed in order to call genius into action. Fate's hammer stroke, which then throws the one to the ground, suddenly strikes steel into another, and while now the shell of everyday life is broken, the erstwhile nucleus lies open to the eyes of the astonished world." Unquote. In another place he writes, quote, "A fire had been lighted, and out of its flames there was bound to come some day the sword which was to regain the freedom of the Germanic Siegfried and the life of the German nation." Unquote. How, one may ask, was it possible for a person with Hitler's past life and abnormal tendencies to take this seriously? The answer is relatively simple. He believed it because he wanted to believe it. In fact, he had to believe it in order to save himself. All the unpleasantries of the past he now interpreted as part of a great design. Just as it was fate which ordained that he should be born on the Austrian side of the border, so it was fate which sent him to Vienna to suffer hardships in order to take the milksop out of him by giving him Dame Sorrow as a foster mother, and kept him at the front where any Negro could shoot him down when he could have rendered a much more worthwhile service elsewhere, and so it was probably fate which decreed his past life and tendencies. These were the crosses he had to bear in order to prove his mettle. He might have been speaking about himself when he said of Germany, quote, "If this battle should not come, never would Germany win peace. Germany would decay, and at the best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. But that is not our destiny. We do not believe that this misfortune which today our God sends over Germany has no meaning. It is surely the scourge which should and shall drive us to new greatness, to a new power and glory." Unquote. Before this new greatness, power, and glory could be achieved, however, it was necessary to conquer the misfortune. The misfortune, in Hitler's case, so he probably thought, was the emotional identification he had made with his mother during childhood. He had used this as a cornerstone for his personality, and it was responsible for his humanity. But it also carried with it a passive, masochistic form of adjustment, which, instead of leading to greatness as he had hoped, had carried him to the brink of degradation, humiliation, and self-destruction. It exposed him to untold dangers which were no longer compatible with self-preservation. Consequently, if he were to survive, and he must rid himself not only of his conscience and intellect, but of all the traits which were associated with false humanity. In its place, he must set a personality which was in keeping with the law of nature. Only after he had achieved this transformation could he feel safe from attack. To overcome his weakness and to grow strong became the dominant motive of his life. Quote, "Feels the obligation in accordance with the eternal will that dominates this universe to promote the victory of the better and stronger, and to demand the submission of the worse and the weaker. A stronger generation will drive out the weaklings, because in its ultimate form, the urge to live will again and again break the ridiculous fetters of so-called humanity of the individual, so that its place will be taken by the humanity of nature, which destroys weakness in order to give its place to strength." Unquote. If our hypothesis concerning his mental processes while he lay helpless in Pasewalk Hospital is correct, we may assume that in order to quiet his fears, he sometimes imagined himself as a person who far surpassed his enemies in all the virile qualities. Under these circumstances, he could conquer his enemies and do to them what he now feared they would do to him. This is, of course, pure wishful thinking, but evidently this play of imagery yielded him so much pleasure that he unconsciously identified himself with this Superman image. We would guess that it was at the moment when this mechanism, which is known as the identification with the aggressor, operated, that the aforementioned hallucination was produced. He was no longer the weak and puny individual who was exposed to all kinds of attacks and indignities. On the contrary, he was fundamentally more powerful than all the others. Instead of being afraid of them, they should be afraid of him. The image Hitler created was a form of compensation for his own inferiorities, insecurities, and guilt. Consequently, the image negated all his former qualities and turned them into their opposites to the same degree. All the human qualities of love, pity, sympathy, and compassion were interpreted as weaknesses and disappeared in the transformation. Quote, "All passivity, all inertia became senseless, inimical to life. the Jewish Christ creed with its effeminate pity ethics. Unless you are prepared to be pitiless, you will get nowhere, unquote. In their place, we find what Hitler's warped mind conceived to be the supermasculine view. Quote, if a people is to become free, it needs pride and willpower, defiance, hate, and once again hate. Brutality is respected, brutality and physical strength. The plain man in the street respects nothing but brutal strength and ruthlessness. We want to be the supporters of the dictatorship of national reason, of national energy, of national brutality and resolution, unquote. Anti-Semitism. When the identification with the aggressor mechanism is used, however, there was no conscious struggle within the personality in which the new personality gradually overcomes the old one. The identification takes place outside the realm of consciousness, and the individual suddenly feels that he is this new person. There is no process of integration or assimilation. The old personality is automatically suppressed, and its characteristics are projected onto some external object against which the new personality can carry on the struggle. In Hitler's case, all his undesirable characteristics were projected onto the Jew. To Hitler, he became evil incarnate and responsible for all the world's difficulties, just as Hitler's earlier femininity now appeared to him to be the source of all his personal difficulties. This projection was relatively easy for him to make, inasmuch as in his Vienna days, the Jew had become for him the symbol of sex, disease, and his perversion. Now another load of undesirable qualities was poured upon his head, with the result that Hitler now hated and despised the Jew with the same intensity as he hated his former self. Obviously, Hitler could not rationalize his projection as long as he stood by himself as a single individual, nor could he combat the Jew single-handed. For this he needed a large group which would fit the picture he had created. He found this in defeated Germany as a whole. At the close of the war, it was in a position almost identical with his own before the transformation had taken place. It, too, was weak and exposed to further attack and humiliation. It, too, had to be prepared to eat the dirt of the conquerors, and during the inflation period, it, too, was confused, passive, and helpless. It, therefore, made an excellent symbol of his earlier self, and Hitler again shifted his personal problems to a national and racial scale where he could deal with them more objectively. Providence had given him the spark, which transformed him overnight. It was now his mission to transform the remainder of the German people by winning them to his view of life and the new order. The Jews now played the same role in the life of Germany as his effeminate, masochistic, and perverse adjustment had played in his own life. He now resolved to become a politician. Many writers have expressed the opinion that Hitler's anti-Semitism is motivated primarily by its great propaganda value. Undoubtedly, anti-Semitism is the most powerful weapon in his propaganda arsenal, and Hitler is well aware of it. He has even expressed the opinion on several occasions that the Jews would make Germany rich. All our informants who knew him well, however, agree that this is superficial, and that underneath he has a sincere hatred for the Jews and everything Jewish. This is in complete agreement with our hypothesis. We do not deny that he often uses anti-Semitism propagandistically when it suits his purpose. We do maintain, however, that behind this superficial motivation is a much deeper one, which is largely unconscious. Just as Hitler had to exterminate his former self in order to get the feeling of being great and strong, so must Germany exterminate the Jews if it is to attain its new glory. Both are poisons which slowly destroy their respective bodies and bring about death. Quote, all the great cultures of the past perished only because the originally creative race died off through blood poisoning. Alone, the loss of purity of the blood destroys the inner happiness forever. It eternally lowers man, and never again can its consequences be removed from body and mind, unquote. The symbolism in these quotations is obvious, and the frequency with which they recur in his speaking and writing bears testimony to their great importance in his thinking and feeling processes. It would seem that from this, that unconsciously he felt that if he succeeds in ridding himself of his personal poison, his effeminate and perverse tendencies as symbolized in the Jew, then he would achieve personal immortality. In his treatment of the Jews, we see the identification with the aggressor mechanism at work. He is now practicing on the Jews in reality the things he feared the victors might do to him in fantasy. From this he derives a manifold satisfaction. First, it affords him an opportunity of appearing before the world as a pitiless brute that he imagines himself to be. Second, it affords him an opportunity of proving to himself that he is as heartless and brutal as he wants to be, that he can really take it. Third, in eliminating the Jews, he unconsciously feels that he is ridding himself and Germany of the poison which is responsible for all difficulties. Fourth, as the masochist he really is, he derives a vicarious pleasure from the suffering of others in whom he can see himself. Fifth, he can give vent to his bitter hatred and contempt for the world, in general, by using the Jew as a scapegoat. And sixth, it pays heavy material and propagandistic dividends. Early political career. Armed with this new view of life, Hitler sought for opportunities to put his resolve to become a politician into effect and start on the long road which would redeem Germany and lead her to new greatness and glory. This was not easy in post-war Germany, which was now engaged in violent internal strife. He remained in the reserve army for a time, where he engaged in its first political activity, that of spying on his comrades. His duties were to mingle with the men in his barracks and engage them in political discussions. Those who voiced opinions with a communistic flavor he reported to his superior officers. Later, when the offenders were brought to trial, it was his job to take the witness stand and give the testimony which would send these comrades to their death. This was a severe trial for his new character, but he carried it off in a brazen and unflinching manner. It must have given him tremendous satisfaction to find that he actually could play this new role in such an admirable fashion. Not long afterwards, it was discovered that he had had a talent for oratory, and he was rewarded for his services by being promoted to instructor. The new Hitler, the Embroyo Führer, was beginning to pay dividends. Identification with the aggressor is at best an unstable form of adjustment. The individual always has a vague feeling that something is not just as it should be, although he is not aware of its origins. Nevertheless, he feels insecure in his new role, and in order to rid himself of his uneasiness, he must prove to himself over and over again that he is really the type of person he believes himself to be. The result is a snowball effect. Every brutality must be followed by a greater brutality, every violence by a greater violence, every atrocity by a greater atrocity, every gain in power by a greater gain in power, and so on down the line. Unless this is achieved successfully, the individual begins to feel insecure, and doubts concerning his borrowed character begin to creep in together with feelings of guilt regarding his shortcomings. This is the key to an understanding of Hitler's actions since the beginning of his political activities to the present day. This effect has not escaped the attention of non-psychological observers. François Poncet, for example, writes in the French Yellow Book, quote, "The Chancellor chafes against all these disappointments with indignant impatience. Far from conducing him to moderation, these obstacles irritate him. He is aware of the enormous blunder which the anti-Jewish persecutions of last November have proved to be. Yet by a contradiction which is part of the dictator's psychological makeup, he is said to be preparing to enter upon a merciless struggle against the Church and Catholicism. Perhaps he thus wishes to wipe out the memory of past violence with fresh violence." Unquote. The mechanism feeds on itself and must continue to grow in order to maintain itself. Since it has no real foundations to support it, the individual can never quite convince himself that he is secure and need fear no longer. The result is that he can brook no delays, but must plunge ahead on his mad career. Hitler's political career shows these tendencies to a marked degree. Scarcely had he affiliated himself with the group which had founded the party than he connived to get control over it. Then followed a rapid expansion of membership, the introduction of terror, a series of broken promises, collusions, and betrayals. Each brought him fresh gains and new power, but the pace was still too slow to satisfy him. In 1923, he believed himself to be strong enough to undertake a putsch and seize the reins of government. The putsch failed, and Hitler's conduct during it has been the subject of much comment. There are a number of versions concerning what happened. Some report that when the troops fired on them, Hitler fell to the ground and crawled through an alley, which carried him to safety, while Ludendorff, Röhm, and Göring marched ahead. Some claim that he stumbled, others that he was knocked down by his bodyguard who was killed. The Nazi version is that he stopped to pick up a small child who had run out into the street and been knocked down. Years later, they produced a child on the anniversary of the event to prove the story. From a psychological point of view, it would appear that he turned coward on this occasion, and that he did fall down and crawl away from the scene of activities. Although he had usurped considerable power and reason to have faith in his new character, he seems unlikely it seems unlikely that it was sufficient for him to actually engage the recognized authority in physical combat. His attitude towards recognized superiors and authority in general would make such a direct attack improbable. Furthermore, his reactions after his escape would seem to indicate that his new role had temporarily failed. He went into a deep depression and was restrained from committing suicide only by constant reassurances. When he was taken to Landsberg prison, he went on a hunger strike and refused to eat for 3 weeks. This was his response to being placed again in the position of the vanquished. Perhaps memories of his fantasies in the hospital were returning to harass him. It was only after he discovered that his jailers were not unkindly disposed to him that he permitted himself to be persuaded to take food. During his stay in Landsberg, he became much quieter. Luedecke says, quote, Landsberg had done him a world of good. Gone from his manner was the nervous intensity which formerly had been his most unpleasant characteristic, unquote. It was during this period that he wrote Mein Kampf, and we may suppose that his failure in the putsch made it necessary for him to take a fresh inventory and integrate his new character more firmly. He resolved at this time not to try another putsch in the future, but to gain the power by legal means alone. In other words, he would not participate again in an open conflict with recognized authority. Rise to power. It is scarcely necessary for us to trace the history of his rise to power and his actions after he achieved it. They all follow along the same general pattern we have outlined. Each successful step served to convince him that he was the person he believed himself to be, but brought no real sense of security. In order to attain this, he had to go a step higher and give additional proof that he was not deluding himself. Terror, violence, and ruthlessness grew with each advance, and every recognized virtue was turned into a vice, a sign of weakness. Even after he became the undisputed leader of the nation, he could not rest in peace. He projected his own insecurities onto the neighboring states and then demanded that they bow to his power. As long as there was a nation or combination of nations more powerful than Germany, he could never find the peace and security he longed for. It was inevitable that this course would lead to war, because only by that means could he crush the threat and prove to himself that he needed no longer be afraid. It was also inevitable that the war would be as brutal and pitiless as possible, for only in this way could he prove to himself that he was not weakening in his chosen course, but was made of stuff becoming to his conception of what a victor should be. Rages. Although space will not permit a detailed analysis of the operation of the various psychological streams we have enumerated and the determination of his everyday behavior, a few have aroused sufficient speculation to warrant a place in our study. One of the outstanding of these is his rages. Most writers have regarded these as temper tantrums, his reaction to minor frustrations and deprivations. On the surface they appear to be of this nature, and yet, when we study his behavior carefully, we find that when he is confronted by a real frustration or deprivation, such as failure to be elected to the presidency or being refused the chancellorship, his behavior is exactly the opposite. He is very cool and quiet. He is disappointed but not enraged. Instead of carrying on like a spoiled child, he begins immediately to lay plans for a new assault. Haydn, in his biographer, describes this characteristic pattern as follows. Quote, when others after a defeat would have gone home despondently, consoling themselves with the philosophical reflection that it was no use contending against adverse circumstances, Hitler delivered a second and a third assault with sullen defiance. When others after a success would have become more cautious, because they would not dare to put fortune to the proof too often and perhaps exhaust it, Hitler persisted and staked a bigger claim on destiny with every throw, unquote. This does not sound like a person who would fly into a rage at a trifle. Nevertheless, we know that he does fly into these rages and launches into tirades on very slight provocation. If we examine the causes of these outbursts, we almost invariably find that the trigger which sets them off is something which he considers to be a challenge of his Superman personality. It may be a contradiction, a criticism, or even a doubt concerning the truth or wisdom of something he has said or done, or it might be a slight or the anticipation of opposition. Even though the subject may be trifling, or the challenge only by implication, or even wholly imagined, he feels called upon to display his primitive character. Francois Ponce has also detected and described this reaction. He writes, quote, those who surround him are the first to admit that he now thinks himself infallible and invincible. That explains why he can no longer bear either criticism or contradiction. To contradict him is in his eyes a crime of lèse majesté. Opposition to his plans, from whatever side it may come, is a definite sacrilege, to which the only reply is an immediate and striking display of his omnipotence, unquote. As soon as his display has served its purpose and cowed his listeners into submission, it is turned off as suddenly as it was turned on. How great is the insecurity which demands such constant vigilance and apprehension! Fear of domination. We find this same insecurity at work when he is meeting new people, and particularly those whom he secretly feels inferior in some way. Earlier in our study, we had occasion to point out that his eyes had taken over a diffuse sexual function. When he first meets the person, he fixates him with his eyes as though to bore through the other person. There is a peculiar glint in them on these occasions, which many have interpreted as a hypnotic quality. To be sure, he uses them in such a way and tries to overpower the other person with them. But if he turns his eyes away, Hitler keeps his fixated directly on him or her. But if the other person returns this gaze, Hitler turns his away and looks up at the ceiling as long as the interview continues. It is as though he were matching his power against theirs. If he succeeds in overpowering the other person, he rudely follows up his advantage. If, however, the other person refuses to succumb to his glance, he avoids the possibility of succumbing to theirs. Likewise, he is unable to match wits with another person in a straightforward argument. He will express his opinion at length, but he will not defend it on logical grounds. Strasser says, quote, "He is afraid of logic. Like a woman, he evades the issue and ends by throwing in your face an argument entirely remote from what you were talking about," unquote. We might suspect that even on this territory he cannot expose himself to a possible defeat which would mar the image he has of himself. He is, in fact, unable to face real opposition on any ground. He cannot speak to a group in which he senses opposition, but walks out on his audience. He has run out of meetings with Ludendorff, Gregor Strasser, Bavarian industrialist, and many others, because he could not risk the possibility of appearing in an inferior light or expose himself to a possible domination by another person. There is reason to suppose that his procrastination is not so much a matter of laziness as it is a fear of coming to grips with a difficult problem. Consequently, he avoids it as long as possible, and it is only when the situation has become dangerous and disaster lies ahead that his inner voice or intuition communicates with him and tells him what course he should follow. Most of his thinking is carried on subconsciously, which probably accounts for his ability to penetrate difficult problems and time his moves. Psychological experiments in this field seem to indicate that on this level the individual is often able to solve very complex problems which are impossible for him on the level of consciousness. Wherever we turn in studying Hitler's behavior patterns, we find the specter of possible defeat and humiliation as one of his dominant motivations. Monuments. His passion for constructing huge buildings, stadia, bridges, roads, etc. can only be interpreted as attempts to compensate for his lack of confidence. These are tangible proofs of his greatness, which are designed to impress himself as well as others. Just as he must be the greatest man in all the world, so he has a tendency to build the greatest and biggest of everything. Most of the structures he has erected he regards as temporary buildings. They are, to his way of thinking, on a par with ordinary mortals. The permanent buildings he plans to construct later on. They will be much larger and grander and will be designed to last at least 1,000 years. In other words, these are befitting monuments to himself, who plans on ruling the German people for that period of time through his new view of life. It is also interesting to note the frequency with which he uses gigantic pillars in all his buildings. Most of the buildings are almost surrounded by them, and he places them in every conceivable place. Since pillars of this sort are almost universally considered to be phallic symbols, we may regard the size and frequency as unconscious attempts to compensate for his own impotence. His huge pageants serve a similar purpose. Oratory. No study of Hitler would be complete without mentioning his oratory talents. His extraordinary gift for swaying large audiences has contributed, perhaps more than any other single factor, to his success and the partial realization of his ideal. In order to understand the power of this appeal, we must be cognizant of the fact that for him the masses are fundamentally feminine in character. To Hafstengel and other informants, he has frequently said, quote, "Die Masse ist ein Weib," unquote. And in Mein Kampf he writes, quote, "The people, in an overwhelming majority, are so feminine in their nature and attitude that their activities and thoughts are motivated less by sober consideration than by feeling and sentiment," unquote. In other words, his unconscious frame of reference when addressing a huge audience is fundamentally that of talking to a woman. In spite of this, his insecurities assert themselves. He never is the first speaker on the program. He must always have a speaker precede him who warms up the audience for him. Even then, he is nervous and jittery when he gets up to speak. Frequently, he has difficulty in finding words with which to begin. He is trying to get the feel of the audience. If it feels favorable, he starts in a rather cautious manner. His tone of voice is quite normal, and he deals with his material in a fairly objective manner. But as he proceeds, his voice begins to rise and his tempo increases. If the response of the audience is good, his voice becomes louder and louder and the tempo faster and faster. By this time, all objectivity has disappeared and a passion has taken complete possession of him. The mouth, which can never utter a fragment of profanity off the speaker's platform, now pours forth a veritable stream of curses, foul names, vilification, and hatred. Hanfstaengl compares the development of a Hitlerian speech with the development of a Wagnerian theme, which may account for Hitler's love of Wagnerian music and the inspiration he derives from it. This steady stream of filth continues to pour forth until both he and the audiences are in a frenzy. When he stops, he is on the verge of exhaustion. His breathing is heavy and uncontrolled, and he is wringing wet with perspiration. Many writers have commented on the sexual components in his speaking, and some have described the climax as a veritable orgasm. Haste writes, quote, "In his speeches we hear the suppressed voice of passion and wooing, which is taken from the language of love. He utters a cry of hate and voluptuousness, a spasm of violence and cruelty. All those tones and sounds are taken from the back streets of the instincts. They remind us of dark impulses repressed too long," unquote. And Hitler himself says, quote, "Passion alone will give to him, who is chosen by her, the words that, like beats of a hammer, are able to open the doors to the heart of a people," unquote. Undoubtedly, he uses speaking as a means of talking himself into the Superman role and living out the role of identification with the aggressor. He carefully builds up imposing enemies, Jews, Bolsheviks, capitalists, democracies, etc., in order to demolish them without mercy. These are all inventions of the Jews to his way of thinking, and consequently in attacking any one of them, he is fundamentally attacking the Jews. Under these circumstances, he appears to the naive and unsophisticated listener as the great redeemer of Germany. But this is only one side of the picture. On the other side, we have the sexual attack which, in his case, is of a perverse nature. It finds expression in his speaking, but due to the transformation of character, everything appears in the reverse. This steady stream of filth he pours on the heads of his feminine audience is the reverse of his masochistic perversion, which finds gratification in having women pour their filth on him. Even the function of the physical organs is reversed. The mouth, which, under ordinary circumstances, is an organ of injection and is surrounded with inhibitions and prohibitions, now becomes the organ through which the filth is ejected. Hitler's speaking has been aptly described as a verbal diarrhea. Rauschening describes it as an oral enema. It is probably this unconscious sexual element in his speaking which holds such a fascination for many people. His appeal. A word may be said in connection with the content of his speeches. Strasser sums it up very concisely when he says, quote, "Hitler responds to the vibrations of the human heart with the delicacy of a seismograph, enabling him, with a certainty with which no conscious gift could endow him, to act as a loudspeaker proclaiming the most secret desires, the least permissible instincts, the sufferings and personal revolts of an entire nation," unquote. We are now in a position to understand how this is possible for him. In regarding his audience as fundamentally feminine in character, his appeal is directed at the repressed part of their personalities. In many of the German people there seems to be a strong feminine masochistic tendency, which is usually covered over by more virile characteristics, but which finds partial gratification in submissive behavior, discipline, sacrifice, etc. Nevertheless, it does seem to disturb them, and they try to compensate for it by going to the other extreme of courage, pugnaciousness, determination, etc. Most Germans are unaware of this hidden part of their personalities and would deny its existence vehemently if such an insinuation is made. Hitler, however, appeals to it directly, and he is in an excellent position to know what goes on in that region because in him this side of his personality was not only conscious but dominant throughout his earlier life. Furthermore, these tendencies were far more intense in him than in the average person, and he had a better opportunity of observing their operation. In addressing an audience in this way, he need only dwell on the longings, ambitions, and hopes and desires of his earlier life in order to awaken these hidden tendencies in his listeners. This he does with inordinate skill. In this way, he is able to arouse the same attitudes and emotions in his listeners that he himself now experiences in connection with this type of adjustment, and is able to direct these into the same channels that he has found useful. Thus, he is able to win them to his new view of life, which sets a premium on brutality, ruthlessness, dominance, determination, etc., and which frowns upon all the established human qualities. The key is always to strive to be what you are not, and do your best to exterminate that which you are. The behavior of the German armies has been an outstanding manifestation of this contradiction. To the psychologist, it seems as though the brutality expressed towards the people of the occupied countries is motivated not only by a desire to prove to themselves that they are what they are not, but also by a vicarious, masochistic gratification which they derive from an identification with their victims. On the whole, one could say of many of the German troops what Rauschning said of Hitler, quote, "There lies behind Hitler's emphasis on brutality and ruthlessness the desolation of a forced and artificial inhumanity, not the amorality of the genuine brute, which has, after all, something of the power of a natural force," unquote. It is Hitler's ability to play upon the unconscious tendencies of the German people and to act as their spokesman, which has enabled him to mobilize their energies and direct them into the same channels through which he believed he had found a solution to his own personal conflicts. The result has been an extraordinary similarity in thinking, feeling, and acting in the German people. It is as though Hitler has paralyzed the critical functions of the individual Germans and had amassed the role for himself. As such, he has been incorporated as part of the personalities of his individual supporters and is able to dominate their mental processes. It is this phenomenon which lies at the very root of the peculiar bond which exists between Hitler as a person and the German people, and places it beyond the control of any purely rational, logical, or intellectual appeal. In fighting for Hitler, these persons are now unconsciously fighting for what appears to them to be their own psychological integrity. All of this throws a very interesting light on the underlying psychology of a large part of the German people, both in war and in peace, and one is forced to suspect that fundamental changes within the German culture itself must be effected before the German people are ready to play a constructive role in a family of nations. A consideration of these aspects of the problem, however, lie beyond the scope of the present study. Hitler's probable behavior in the future. As the tide of battle turns against Hitler, it may be well to consider very briefly the possibilities of his future behavior and the effect that each would have on the German people as well as on ourselves. 1. Hitler may die of natural causes. This is only a remote possibility since, as far as we know, he is in fairly good health except for his stomach ailment, which is, in all probability, a psychosomatic disturbance. In effect, such an event would have on the German people would depend on the nature of the illness which brought him about his death. If he would die from whooping cough, mumps, or some other ridiculous disease, it would be a material help in breaking the myth of his supernatural origins. 2. Hitler might seek refuge in a neutral country. This is extremely unlikely in view of his great concern about his immortality. Nothing would break the myth more effectively than to have the leader run away at the critical moment. Hitler knows this and has frequently condemned the Kaiser for his flight to Holland at the close of the last war. Hitler might want to escape as he has escaped from other unpleasant situations, but it seems almost certain that he would restrain himself. 3. Hitler may get killed in battle. This is a real possibility. When he is convinced that he cannot win, he may lead his troops into battle and expose himself as the fearless and fanatical leader. This would be most undesirable from our point of view, because his death would serve as an example to his followers to fight on with fanatical, death-defying determination to the bitter end. This would be what Hitler would want, for he has predicted that, quote, "We shall not capitulate, no, never. We may be destroyed, but if we are, we shall drag a world with us, a world in flames. Even if we could not conquer them, we should drag half the world into destruction with us, and leave no one to triumph over Germany. There will not be another 1918, unquote. At a certain point, he could do more towards the achievement of this goal by dying heroically than he could by living. Furthermore, the death of this kind would do more to bind the German people to the Hitler legend and ensure his immortality than any other course he could pursue. 4. Hitler may be assassinated. Although Hitler is extremely well protected, there is a possibility that someone may assassinate him. Hitler is afraid of this possibility and has expressed the opinion that, quote, his own friends would one day stab him mortally in the back, and it would be just before the last and greatest victory, at the moment of supreme tension. Once more Hagen would slay Siegfried. Once more Hermann the Liberator would be murdered by his own kinsmen. The eternal destiny of the German nation must be fulfilled yet again for the last time, unquote. This possibility, too, would be undesirable from our point of view, inasmuch as it would make a martyr of him and strengthen the legend. It would be even more undesirable if the assassin were a Jew, for this would convince the German people of Hitler's infallibility and strengthen the fanaticism of the German troops and people. Needless to say, it would be followed by the complete extermination of all Jews in Germany and the occupied countries. 5. Hitler may go insane. Hitler has many characteristics which border on the schizophrenic. It is possible that when faced with defeat, his psychological structure may collapse and leave him at the mercy of his unconscious forces. The possibilities of such an outcome diminish as he becomes older, but they should not be entirely excluded. This would not be an undesirable eventuality from our point of view, since it would do much to undermine the Hitler legend in the minds of the German people. 6. The German military might revolt and seize him. This seems unlikely in view of the unique position Hitler holds in the minds of the German people. From all the evidence, it would seem that Hitler alone is able to rouse the troops, as well as the people, to greater efforts, and as the road becomes more difficult, this should be an important factor. One could imagine, however, that as defeat approaches, Hitler's behavior may become more and more neurotic, and reach a point where it would well be for the military to confine him. In this case, however, the German people would probably never know about it. If they discovered it, it would be a desirable end from our point of view, because it would puncture the myth of the loved and invincible leader. The only other possibility in this connection would be that the German military should decide, in the face of defeat, that it might be wiser to dethrone Hitler and set up a puppet government to sue for peace. This would probably cause great internal strife in Germany. What the ultimate outcome might be would depend largely on the manner in which it was handled and what was done with Hitler. At the present time, the possibility seems rather remote. 7. Hitler may fall into our hands. This is the most unlikely possibility of all. Knowing his fear of being placed in the role of the vanquished, we can imagine that he would do his utmost to avoid such a fate. It should, however, be considered as a possibility, if for no other reason than that we have a precedent for such behavior in the case of Jan Bokelson. His early life, character, and career bear an uncanny resemblance to that of Hitler. In the final stages of his mad career, his masochistic tendencies got the upper hand, and he surrendered to his enemies and proposed to them that they confine him in a cage and exhibit him throughout the country in order that the people, for a small admission fee, might look at him and express their contempt. In Hitler's case, such an outcome seems remote, but it is difficult to estimate the extent to which an extreme masochist will go in order to gratify these tendencies. From our point of view, it would be most desirable to have Hitler fall into our hands, and in the long run, it would probably be a benefit to the German people as well. 8. Hitler might commit suicide. This is the most plausible outcome. Not only has he frequently threatened to commit suicide, but from what we know of his psychology, it is the most likely possibility. It is probably true that he has an inordinate fear of death, but being an hysteric, he could undoubtedly screw himself up into the Superman character and perform the deed. In all probability, however, it would not be a simple suicide. He has much too much of the dramatic for that, and since immortality is one of his dominant motives, we can imagine that he would stage the most dramatic and effective death scene he could possibly think of. He knows how to bind the people to him, and if he cannot have the bond in life, he will certainly do his utmost to achieve it in death. He might even engage some other fanatic to do the final killing at his orders. Hitler has already envisioned a death of this kind, for he has said to Rauschning, yet, quote, "Yes, in the hour of supreme peril, I must sacrifice myself for the people," unquote. This would be extremely undesirable from our point of view, because it is cleverly done. It would establish the Hitler legend so firmly in the minds of the German people that it might take generations to eradicate. Whatever else happens, we may be reasonably sure that as Germany suffers successive defeats, Hitler will become more and more neurotic. Each defeat will shake his confidence still further and limit his opportunities for proving his own greatness to himself. In consequence, he will feel himself more and more vulnerable to attack from his associates, and his rages will increase in frequency. He will probably try to compensate for his vulnerability by continually stressing his brutality and ruthlessness. His public appearances will become less and less, for, as we have seen, he is unable to face a critical audience. He will probably seek solace in his eagle's nest or on the Kelstein near Berchtesgaden. There among the ice-capped peaks, he will wait for his inner voice to guide him. Meanwhile, his nightmares will probably increase in frequency and intensity and drive him closer to a nervous collapse. It is not wholly improbable that in the end he might lock himself into this symbolic womb and defy the world to get him. In any case, his mental condition will continue to deteriorate. He will fight as long as he can with any weapon or technique that can be conjured up to meet the emergency. The course he will follow will almost certainly be the one which seems to him to be the surest road to immortality, and at the same time wreak the greatest vengeance on a world he despises.